Chapter 8. The reactions were mixed among Dimitri's family members. Some cried. Some were stunned. And some, mainly Yeva and Victoria, simply took it in and kept their emotions from their faces. Just as Dimitri would have done. That upset me almost as much as the tears. It reminded me too much of him. Out of all of them, pregnant Sonia, who came home shortly after the news broke, had the most intense physical reaction. She ran sobbing to her room and wouldn't come out. It didn't take long, however, for Yeva and Alina to spring into action. They spoke rapidly in Russian, clearly planning something. Phone calls were made, and Victoria was dispatched to run an errand. No one seemed to need me. So I mostly wandered the house and tried to stay out of the way. I found myself studying the shelves I'd seen earlier, running my hands along the leather-bound books. The titles were in Cyrillic. But it didn't matter. Touching them and imagining Dimitri having held and read them somehow made me feel closer to him. Looking for a little light reading? Sydney walked up and stood beside me. She hadn't been around earlier but had heard the news. Very light, seeing as I don't understand any of them, I replied. I gestured to the scurrying family members. What's going on here? They're planning Dimitri's funeral, Sydney explained. Or, well, his memorial service. I frowned. But he's not dead. Shoo. She cut me off with a sharp gesture and glanced warily at the others as they hustled around. Don't say that. But it's true, I hissed back. She shook her head. Not to them. Out here, out in these villages, there's no in-between state. You're alive or you're dead. They aren't going to acknowledge him being one of those. She couldn't keep the disgust out of her voice. For all intents and purposes, he is dead to them. They'll mourn him and move on. So should you. I didn't take offense at her blunt attitude because I knew she hadn't meant to give any. It was just her way. The problem was, that in-between state was very real to me, and there was no way I could move on. Not yet. Rose, began Sydney after several seconds of silence. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry. You mean, for Dimitri? Yeah. I had no idea. I haven't really been that nice to you. I mean, I'm not going to act like I feel any better about hanging out with your kind, but you guys are still, well, not human, obviously. But I don't know. You still have feelings, you still love and hurt. And while we were coming here, you had all this horrible news in you, and I didn't make it any easier for you. So I'm sorry for that. And I'm sorry for thinking the worst of you. At first, I thought she was talking about thinking I was evil, but then I got it. She'd thought this whole time that I really was coming to be a blood whore and now believed delivering the news to Dimitri's family had been my only purpose. I didn't bother to correct her. Thanks. But you couldn't have known. And honestly, if I were in your place, I don't know. I'd probably act the same way. No, she said. You wouldn't. You're always nice to people. I gave her an incredulous look. Have you been traveling with someone else these last few days? Back home, I've got a reputation for not always being so nice. I've got attitude, and I know it. She smiled. Yeah, you do. But you also say the right things to people when you have to. Telling the Belikovs what you did, well, that was hard. And no matter what you say, you can be polite and go out of your way to make people feel good. Most of the time. I was a bit startled. Was that how I appeared? I often thought of myself as a trigger-happy queen bitch and tried to think about my behavior with her these last few days. I had sparred with her a lot, but among the others we'd met, I supposed I had been friendly. Well, thanks, I said, not knowing what else to say. Did you see Abe yet? When you walked around town? No, I said, realizing I'd forgotten about my mysterious rescuer. Should I have? I just figured he'd find you. Who is he? Why did he come get us when you told him I was hurt? Sydney hesitated. And I thought I was going to get some more of the alchemist's silent treatment. Then, after glancing around uneasily, she said in a low voice, Abe's not royal, but he's a really important guy. He's not Russian either, but he's in the country a lot, always on business both illegal and legal, I think. He's friends with all the important moroi, and half the time. It seems like he controls the alchemists, too. I know he's involved in the process of making our tattoos, but his business goes far beyond that. We have a name for him behind his back. Zmay. Zma what? I had barely heard the word. It sounded like Zz-May. It was certainly nothing I'd ever heard before. She gave a small smile at my confusion. Zmay is Russian for snake. But not just any snake. Her eyes narrowed as she pondered a better explanation. It's a term used in lots of myths. Sometimes for giant snakes heroes have to battle. There are also a few stories about wizards with snake blood who get called that. The snake in the Garden of Eden? Who made Eve fall? He was called a Zmay too. I shivered. Okay. That was pretty freaky, but it made something click into place. The alchemists allegedly had ties to leaders and authorities, and Abe apparently wielded a lot of influence with them. Is Abe the one who wanted you to come with me to Baya? The reason the alchemists made you come here? Again, she paused, then nodded. Yeah, when I called that night in St. Petersburg. I was told there was a search going on for you. Abe gave orders through the alchemists for me to stay with you until he could meet up with us here. He's apparently been searching for you on someone's behalf. I went cold. My fears were being realized. People had been looking for me. But who? If Lissa had initiated a manhunt, I would have sensed it when I visited her mind. I didn't think it was Adrian either, not from the way he seemed so desperate and clueless about my whereabouts. Plus, he seemed to accept my need for this quest. So who was looking for me? And for what reason? This Abe sounded like a high-ranking person, albeit someone involved in shady business, someone who might very well be connected to the Queen or others almost as important. Had he been ordered to find me and bring me back? Or considering how much the Queen hated me, had he perhaps been ordered to make sure I didn't come back? Was I dealing with an assassin? Sydney certainly seemed to regard him with a weird mix of fear and respect. Maybe I don't want to meet him, I said. I don't think he'll hurt you. I mean, if he wanted to, he already would have. But be careful. He's always playing several games at once, and he deals in enough secrets to rival the alchemists. So you don't trust him? She gave me a rueful grin as she turned to walk away. You forget, I don't trust any of you. When she was gone, I decided to go outside, away from the sorrow and business indoors. I sat down on the top step of the backyard porch, watching Paul play. He was building a fort for some of his action figures. While sensitive to the grief in his family, it was hard for him to be too affected by the death of an uncle he'd only met a couple of times. The news didn't mean as much to him as it did to the rest of us. With so much time on my hands for the rest of the day, I decided to do a quick check-in with Lissa. In spite of myself, I was kind of curious about how things had panned out with Avery Lazar. While Lissa's intentions were good, she'd still had some misgivings about bringing Avery along to lunch. And yet, she was pleasantly surprised to see Avery fitting in perfectly, charming both Adrian and Christian. Admittedly, Adrian was impressed by pretty much anything female. Christian was harder to crack. But even he seemed to be growing fond of her, probably because she kept teasing Adrian. Anyone who could make a joke at Adrian's expense ranked high on Christian's list. So, explain this, Avery said, winding linguini around her fork. You just, hang around the academy all day? Are you trying to redo your high school experience? Nothing to redo, said Adrian loftily. I totally ruled my high school. I was worshipped and adored, not that that should come as a shock. Beside him, Christian nearly choked on his food. So, you're trying to relive your glory days. It's all gone downhill since then, huh? No way, said Adrian. I'm like a fine wine. I get better with age. The best is yet to come. Seems like it'd get old after a while, said Avery. Apparently not convinced by the compelling wine simile. I'm certainly bored, and I even spend part of the day helping my dad. Adrian sleeps most of the day, noted Lissa, trying to keep a straight face. So he doesn't actually have to worry about finding things to do. Hey, I spend a good portion of my time helping you unravel the mysteries of spirit. Adrian reminded her. Avery leaned forward, curiosity all over her pretty face. So it's actually real? I heard stories about spirit, about how you can heal people. It took Lissa a moment to respond. She wasn't sure she'd ever get used to her magic being out in the open now. Among other things. We're still figuring it out. Adrian was more eager than she was to discuss it, probably in the hopes of impressing Avery, and provided a quick rundown of some of Spirit's abilities, like auras and compulsion. And, he added, I can visit people in their dreams. Christian held up a hand. Stop. I can feel there's a comment coming on about how women already dream about you. I just ate, you know. I wasn't going to go there, said Adrian. But he kind of looked like he wished he'd thought of the joke first. I couldn't help being a little amused. Adrian was so brash and flippant in public, and then, in my dreams, he'd show that serious and concerned side. He was more complex than anyone gave him credit for. Avery looked floored. Man. I used to think using air was cool. I guess not. A small breeze suddenly blew her hair back, making her look as though she were posing for a swimsuit photo shoot. She gave the group a dazzling smile. All that was missing was a photographer. The sound of the bell made them all stand up. Christian realized he'd left homework in another class and hurried off to get it after kissing Lissa goodbye. Of course. Adrian departed equally as fast. The teachers start giving me dirty looks if I hang around once classes start. He gave Lissa and Avery a small half-bow. Until next time, ladies. Avery, who couldn't care less about what teachers thought, walked with Lissa to her next class. The older girl's face was thoughtful. So, you really are with Christian, right? Was she ever? If Avery'd seen half the things I'd seen Christian and Lissa do through the bond, there'd be no question. Lissa laughed. Yes, why? Avery hesitated, piquing Lissa's curiosity. Well. I heard that you were involved with Adrian. Lissa nearly stopped walking. Where did you hear that? At court. The Queen was saying how happy she is about you guys being a couple and how you're always together. Lissa groaned. That's because whenever I go to court, she invites him too and then sends us both off to do things for her. It's not by choice. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't mind spending time with him. But the reason we're always together there is because Tatiana makes us. She seems to like you, though. She talks about you all the time. About how much potential you have and how proud she is of you. I think she's proud to manipulate me. Going there is such a pain. She either completely ignores the fact that I'm dating Christian or takes whatever chance she can get to slip in insults about him. Queen Tatiana, like so many other people, could never forgive Christian's parents for willingly turning Strigoi. Sorry, said Avery, looking like she felt really bad. I didn't mean to bring up a bad subject. I just kind of wanted to know if Adrian was available, that's all. Lissa wasn't mad at Avery. Her fury was turned toward the queen. At how she assumed everyone would behave the way she wanted and dance when she commanded it. The Moroi world had been ruled by a king or a queen since the beginning of time, and sometimes Lissa thought it was time for a change. They needed a system where everyone had an equal say, royal and non-royal alike. Even the Dampiers. The more she thought about it, the more she felt her temper spike, anger and frustration flaring up in a way more common to me than her. It made her want to scream sometimes. To walk right up to Tatiana and tell her their deal was off. No college was worth this. Maybe she'd even tell Tatiana that it was time for a revolution. Time to overturn the Morois backward. Lissa blinked, astonished to find she was shaking. Where had that emotion come from? It was one thing to be upset with Tatiana, but this. She hadn't had such out-of-control rages since she first began using spirit. With a deep breath, she tried to use some of the calming techniques she'd acquired so that Avery wouldn't know what a nutcase she'd nearly turned into. I just hate people talking about me, that's all. Lissa said at last. Avery hadn't seemed to notice Lissa's lapse into anger. Well, if it makes you feel better, not everyone thinks that about you. I met a girl. Mia? Yeah, that was her name. Some non-royal. Avery's dismissive tone suggested she held the view a lot of royals had toward common Moroi. She just laughed about you and Adrian being together. Said it was ridiculous. Lissa almost smiled at that. Mia had once been Lissa's rival and a self-centered brat. But after Strigoi killed her mother, Mia had taken on a fierce, determined attitude. One both Lissa and I liked immensely. Mia lived at court with her father, secretly training to fight so that she would be able to battle Strigoi someday. Oh, said Avery suddenly. There's Simon. I should go. Lissa looked across the hall and saw Avery's stern guardian. Simon might not be as grim as Avery's brother Reed. But he still had that same stiff and dour look he'd had when Lissa first met him. Avery seemed to get along with him fine, though. Okay, said Lissa. I'll see you later. You bet, said Avery. Starting to turn. Oh, and Avery? Avery glanced at Lissa. Yeah. Adrian is available. Avery's only answer was a quick grin before she headed off to join Simon. Back with the Belikovs in Baya. The memorial service was going forward. Neighbors and friends, all Dampiers, slowly arrived, many bringing food. It was my first glimpse of the Damper community. Though it still didn't seem as mysterious as Sydney had implied. The kitchen turned into a banquet hall, with every counter and table surface covered in dishes. Some were foods I knew. And there were lots of desserts, cookies and pastries covered in nuts and icing that smelled freshly baked. Some of the dishes I'd never seen before and wasn't sure I wanted to ever again. There was a slimy bowl of cabbage in particular that I went out of my way to avoid. But before we ate, everyone went outside and gathered in a semicircle in the backyard. It was the only place that could accommodate so many people. A priest appeared just then, a human one. That surprised me a little, but I supposed when living in a human town, Dampiers would attend a human church. And to most humans, Dampiers looked just like them, so the priest no doubt thought he was making an ordinary house call. A handful of Moroi who had been in town were also present, but they, too, could more or less pass for humans, pale ones if they were discreet with the fangs. Humans didn't expect to see the supernatural, so their minds rarely considered it an option, even when it was right in front of them. Everyone grew silent. It was sunset now. With orange fire burning in the western sky, and shadows falling across all of us. The priest performed a funeral service in Russian, chanting in a voice that sounded unearthly in the darkening yard. All the church services I'd ever attended were in English, but I could see how this had the same feel. Every so often, those gathered would cross themselves. I didn't know the cues. So I simply watched and waited, letting the priest's mournful voice fill my soul. My feelings for Dimitri churned within me like a growing storm, and I worked to keep them locked up in my heart. When the service finally finished, the eerie tension that had engulfed the group dispersed. People moved again, hugging the Belikovs and shaking hands with the priest. He left shortly thereafter. Food followed. Plates were loaded up, and everyone sat wherever they could find space, be it inside the house or in the backyard. None of the guests really knew me. And Dimitri's family was far too busy to pay much attention to me as they ran around and tried to make everyone feel welcome. Sydney stayed with me a lot of the time. And while conversation was light between us, I took comfort in her presence. We sat on the living room floor, leaning against the wall near the bookcase. She picked over her food, like always. Which made me smile. There was something soothing about that familiar habit. When dinner was over, people continued chatting in small groups. I couldn't understand any of it. But I kept hearing his name mentioned, Dimitri, Dimitri. It reminded me of the incomprehensible hissing that the ghosts made during their visits. It was oppressive and smothering. The force of his name pressing on my heart. Dimitri, Dimitri. After a while, it grew to be too much. Sydney had stepped away for a bit, so I went outside to get some air. Some people had built a bonfire in the back and were sitting around it, still talking about Dimitri, so I headed off toward the front yard. I walked down the street, not intending to go far. The night was warm and clear, with the moon and stars burning brightly in the blackness above me. My feelings were tangled up, and now that I was away from the others, I allowed a bit of that pent-up emotion to burst forth, coming out as silent tears on my cheeks. When I was a couple of houses away, I sat down on the curb, resting and enjoying the stillness around me. My peace was short-lived, however my sharp ears picked up the sound of voices coming from the Belikov house. 3 figures appeared. One, tall and slim, was Moroi, and the others were Dampiers. I stared as they came to a stop in front of me. Not bothering with formalities, I remained where I was, looking up into the Moroi's dark eyes. I didn't recognize this group from the service, but I did recognize the Moroi from somewhere else. I gave him a wry half-smile. Abe Mazur, I presume. Chapter 9. I thought you were a dream, I said. They all remained standing, the Dampiers fanning out around the Moroi in a sort of protective formation. Abe's was the strange face I'd seen while I'd been going in and out of consciousness after the fight by the barn. He was older than me, close to Alina's age. He had black hair and a goatee, and about as tan a complexion as Moroi ever had. If you've ever seen tan or dark-skinned people who are sick and grow pale, it's a lot like that. There was some pigment in his skin, but it was underscored by an intense pallor. Most astonishing of all was his clothing. He wore a long dark coat that screamed money, paired with a cashmere crimson scarf. Below it, I could see a bit of gold, a chain to match the gold hoop earring he wore in one of his ears. My initial impression of that flamboyance would have been pirate or pimp. A moment later, I changed my mind. Something about him said he was the kind of guy who broke kneecaps to get his way. Dream, eh? That, the Moroi said, with the very slightest hint of a smile, is not something I hear very often. Well, no. He reconsidered. I do occasionally show up in people's nightmares. He was neither American nor Russian, I couldn't identify the accent. Was he trying to impress me or intimidate me with his big, bad reputation? Sydney hadn't been afraid of him, exactly, but she'd certainly possessed a healthy amount of wariness. Well, I assume you already know who I am, I said. So, the question now is, what are you doing here? No, he said, the smile turning harder. The question is, what are you doing here? I gestured back to the house, trying to play it cool. I'm going to a funeral. That's not why you came to Russia. I came to Russia to tell the Belikovs that Dimitri was dead. Seeing as no one else bothered to. That was turning into a handy explanation for me being here, but as Abe studied me, a chill ran down my spine, kind of like when Yeva looked at me. Like that crazy old woman, he didn't believe me, and again I felt the dangerous edge to his otherwise jovial personality. Abe shook his head, and now the smile was gone altogether. That's not the reason either. Don't lie to me, little girl. I felt my hackles going up. And don't interrogate me, old man. Not unless you're ready to tell me why you and your sidekicks risked driving that road to pick up Sydney and me. Abe's dampiers stiffened at the words old man, but to my surprise. He actually smiled again, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I was just helping out. Not from what I hear. You're the one who had the alchemists send Sydney with me here. Oh? He arched an eyebrow. Did she tell you that? That was bad behavior on her part. Her superiors aren't going to like that. Not at all. Oh, damn. I'd spoken without thinking. I didn't want Sydney to get in trouble. If Abe really was some kind of Moroi godfather type, what had she called him? Zmei? The snake? I didn't doubt he could talk to other alchemists to make her life even more miserable. I forced it out of her, I lied. I threatened her on the train. It wasn't hard. She's already scared to death of me. I don't doubt she is. They're all scared of us. Bound by centuries of tradition and hiding behind their crosses to protect them despite the gifts they get from their tattoos. In a lot of ways. They get the same traits as you dampiers, just no reproductive issues. He gazed up at the stars as he spoke, like some sort of philosopher musing on the mysteries of the universe. Somehow. That made me angrier. He was treating this like a joke, when clearly he had some agenda regarding me. I didn't like being part of anyone's plans, particularly when I didn't know what those plans were. Yeah, I'm sure we could talk about the alchemists and how you control them all night, I snapped. But I still want to know what you want with me. Nothing, he said simply. Nothing? You've gone to a lot of trouble to set me up with Sydney and follow me here for nothing. He looked back down from the sky, and there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. You're of no interest to me. I have my own business to run. I come on behalf of others who are interested in you. I stiffened, and at last, true fear ran through me. Shit. There was a manhunt out for me. But who? Lissa? Adrian? Tatiana? Again, that last one made me nervous. The others would seek me out because they cared. But Tatiana? Tatiana feared I'd run off with Adrian. Once more I thought that if she wanted me found, it might be because she wanted to ensure I didn't come back. Abe struck me as the kind of person who could make people disappear. And what do the others want? Do they want me home? I asked, trying to appear unafraid. Did you think you could just come here and drag me back to the US? That secretive smile of Abe's returned. Do you think I could just drag you back? Well, I scoffed, again without thinking, you couldn't. Your guys here could. Well, maybe. I might be able to take them. Abe laughed out loud for the first time, a rich, deep sound filled with sincere amusement. You live up to your brash reputation. Delightful. Great. Abe probably had a whole file on me somewhere. He probably knew what I liked for breakfast. I'll make a trade with you. Tell me why you're here, and I'll tell you why I'm here. I already told you. In a flash, the laughter was gone. He took a step closer to where I sat. And I saw his guardians tense. And I told you not to lie to me. You've got a reason for being here. I need to know what it is. Rose? Can you come in here? Back toward the Belikov house. Victoria's clear voice rang out in the night. Glancing behind me, I saw her standing in the doorway. Suddenly, I wanted to get away from Abe. There was something lethal underneath that gaudy, jovial facade, and I didn't want to spend another minute with him. Leaping up, I began backing toward the house, half expecting his guardians to come kidnap me, despite his words. The two guys stayed where they were, but their eyes watched me carefully. Abe's quirky smile returned to his face. Sorry, I can't stay and chat, I said. That's all right, he said grandly. We'll find time later. Not likely, I said. He laughed, and I hastily followed Victoria into the house, not feeling safe until I shut the door. I do not like that guy. Abe, she asked. I thought he was your friend. Hardly. He's some kind of mobster, right? I suppose, she said, like it was no big deal. But he's the reason you're here. Yeah. I know about him coming to get us. Victoria shook her head. No, I mean here. I guess while you were in the car, you kept saying, Belikov, Belikov. Abe figured you knew us. That's why he took you to our house. That was startling. I'd been dreaming of Dimitri, so of course I would have said his last name. But I'd had no idea that was how I'd ended up here. I'd figured it was because Alina had medical training. Then Victoria added the most astonishing thing of all. When he realized we didn't know you. He was going to take you somewhere else, but grandmother said we had to keep you. I guess she'd had some dream that you'd come to us. What? Crazy, creepy Yeva who hated me? Yeva dreamed about me? Victoria nodded. It's this gift she has. Are you sure you don't know Abe? He's too big time to be here without a reason. Alina hurried over to us before I could respond. She caught hold of my arm. We've been looking for you. What took so long? This question was directed to Victoria. Abe was dash. Alina shook her head. Never mind. Come on. Everyone's waiting. For what? I asked, letting her drag me through the house to the backyard. I was supposed to tell you, explained Victoria, scurrying along. This is the part where everyone sits and remembers Dimitri by telling stories. Nobody's seen him in so long, we don't know what's happened to him recently, said Alina. We need you to tell us. I flinched. Me? I balked at that, particularly when we emerged outside and I saw all those faces around the campfire. I didn't know any of them. How could I talk about Dimitri? How could I reveal what was closest to my heart? Everyone seemed to blur together, and I thought I might faint. For the moment, none of them noticed me. Carolina was speaking, her baby in her arms. Every so often she'd pause, and the others would laugh. Victoria sat down on a blanket-covered spot on the ground and pulled me down beside her. Sydney joined us a little while later. What's she saying? I whispered. Victoria listened to her sister for a few moments and then leaned closer to me. She's talking about when Dimitri was very young. How he used to always beg her and her friends to let him play with them. He was about 6 and they were 8 and didn't want him around. Victoria paused again to take in the next part of the story. Finally, Carolina told him he could if he agreed to be married off to their dolls. So Carolina and her friends dressed him and the dolls up over and kept having weddings. Dimitri was married at least 10 times. I couldn't help but laugh as I tried to picture tough, sexy Dimitri letting his big sister dress him up. He probably would have treated his wedding ceremony with a doll as seriously and stoically as he did his guardian duties. Other people spoke, and I tried to keep up with the translations. All the stories were about Dimitri's kindness and strength of character. Even when not out battling the undead, Dimitri had always been there to help those who needed it. Almost everyone could recall some time that Dimitri had stepped up to help others, going out of his way to do what was right, even in situations that could put him at risk. That was no surprise to me. Dimitri always did the right thing. And it was that attitude that had made me love him so much. I had a similar nature. I too rushed in when others needed me, sometimes when I shouldn't have. Others called me crazy for it, but Dimitri had understood. He'd always understood me. And part of what we'd worked on was how to temper that impulsive need to run into danger with reason and calculation. I had a feeling no one else in this world would ever understand me like he did. I didn't notice how strongly the tears were running down my cheeks until I saw everyone looking at me. At first, I thought they considered me crazy for crying. But then I realized someone had asked me a question. "They want you to talk about Dimitri's last days," Victoria said. "Tell us something. What he did. What he was like." I used my sleeve to clean my face and looked away, focusing on the bonfire. I'd spoken in front of others before without hesitation, but this was different. I can't, I told Victoria. My voice strained and soft. "I can't talk about him." She squeezed my hand. "Please. They need to hear about him. They need to know. Just tell us anything. What was he like?" He was your brother. You know." "Yes," she said gently. "But we want to know what you think he was like." My eyes were still on the fire, watching the way the flames danced and shifted from orange to blue. He was the best man I've ever met." I stopped to gather myself. And Victoria used the opportunity to translate my words into Russian. "And he was one of the best guardians. I mean, he was young compared to a lot of them, but everyone knew who he was. They all knew his reputation, and lots of people relied on him for advice. They called him a god. And whenever there was a fight, or danger, he was always the first one to put himself out there. He never flinched. And a couple months ago, when our school was attacked." I choked up here a bit. The Belikovs had said they knew of the attack, that everyone knew about it, and from the faces here, it was true. I didn't need to elaborate on that night, on the horrors I'd seen. That night, I continued, Dimitri rushed out to face the Strigoi. He and I were together when we realized they were attacking. I wanted to stay and help him, but he wouldn't let me. He just told me to go, to run off and alert others. And he stayed behind, not knowing how many Strigoi he'd have to take on while I went for help. I still don't know how many he fought, but there were a bunch. And he took them all down alone. I dared to look up at the faces around me. Everyone was so quiet and still that I wondered if they were breathing. It was so hard, I told them. Without realizing it. My voice had dropped to a whisper. I had to repeat myself more loudly. It was so hard. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew I had to. He taught me so much. But one of the biggest things was that we have to protect others. It was my duty to warn everyone else, even though I just wanted to stay with him. The whole time, my heart kept saying, "Turn around. Turn around. Go to him." But I knew what I had to do, and I also knew part of him was trying to keep me safe. And if the roles had been reversed, well, I would have made him run too. I sighed. Surprised I'd revealed so much of my heart. I switched back to business. Even when the other guardians joined him, Dimitri never backed down. He took down more Strigoi than almost anyone. Christian and I had actually killed the most. He was amazing. I told them the rest of the story that I'd told the Belikovs. Only I actually forced a little detail this time. Telling them vividly just how brave and fierce he had been. The words hurt me as I spoke, and yet, it was almost a relief to get them out. I'd kept the memories of that night too close to me. But eventually, I had to tell them about the cave. And that was the worst. We'd trapped the escaping Strigoi in a cave. It had 2 entrances, and we came at them from both sides. Some of our people got trapped, though, and there were more Strigoi than we'd expected. We lost people, but we would have lost a lot more if Dimitri hadn't been there. He wouldn't leave until everyone was out. He didn't care about the risk to himself. He only knew he had to save others. I'd seen it in his eyes, that determination. Our plan had finally been to retreat as soon as we were all out, but I'd had the feeling he would have stayed and killed every Strigoi he could find. But he'd followed orders too. Finally beginning his retreat when the others were safe. And in those last moments, just before the Strigoi had bitten him, Dimitri had met my eyes with a look so full of love that it was like that whole cave filled with light. His expression had said what we'd talked about earlier: we can be together, Rose. Soon. We're almost there. And nothing will ever keep us apart again. I didn't mention that part, though. When I finished the rest of the tale, the faces of those gathered were grim but filled with awe and respect. Near the back of the crowd, I noticed Abe and his guardians listening as well. His expression was unreadable. Hard. But not angry or scary. Small cups began circulating through the group, and someone handed me one. A damper I didn't know, one of the few men present, stood up and raised his cup in the air. He spoke loudly and reverently, and I heard Dimitri's name mentioned several times. When he finished, he drank from the cup. Everyone else did too, so I followed suit. And nearly choked to death. It was like fire in liquid form. It took every ounce of strength I had to swallow it and not spray it on those around me. What is this? I asked, coughing. Victoria grinned. Vodka. I peered at the glass. No, it isn't. I've had vodka before. Not Russian vodka. Apparently not. I forced the rest of the cup down out of respect to Dimitri. Even though I had a feeling that if he were here, he'd be shaking his head at me. I thought I was done being in the spotlight after my story, but apparently not. Everyone kept asking me questions. They wanted to know more about Dimitri, more about what his life had been like recently. They also wanted to know about me and Dimitri as a couple. They all seemed to have figured out that Dimitri and I had been in love and they were okay with it. I was asked about how we'd met, how long we'd been together. And the whole time, people kept refilling my cup. Determined not to look like an idiot again, I kept drinking until I could finally take the vodka down without coughing or spitting. The more I drank, the louder and more animated my stories became. My limbs started to tingle, and part of me knew this was all probably a bad idea. Okay, all of me knew it. Finally, people began to clear out. I had no idea what time it was, but I think it was the middle of the night. Maybe later. I stood as well, finding it much harder to do than I'd expected. The world wobbled. And my stomach wasn't very happy with me. Someone caught a hold of my arm and steadied me. Easy, said Sydney. Don't push it. Slowly, carefully, she led me toward the house. God, I moaned. Do they use that stuff as rocket fuel? No one made you keep drinking it. Hey, don't get preachy. Besides, I had to be polite. Sure, she said. We made it inside and then had the impossible task of getting up the stairs to the room Alina had given me. Each step was agony. They all knew about me and Dimitri, I said. Wondering if I'd be saying any of this sober. But I never told them we were together. You didn't have to. It's written all over your face. They acted like I was his widow or something. You might as well be. We reached my room, and she helped me sit down on the bed. Not a lot of people get married around here. If you're with someone long enough, they figure it's almost the same. I sighed and stared off without any particular focus. I miss him so much. I'm sorry, she said. Will it ever get better? The question seemed to catch her by surprise. I don't know. Have you ever been in love? She shook her head. No. I wasn't sure if that made her lucky or not. I wasn't sure if all the bright days I'd had with Dimitri were worth the hurt I felt now. A moment later, I knew the truth. Of course they were. Huh? Asked Sydney. I realized I'd spoken my thoughts out loud. Nothing. Just talking to myself. I should get some sleep. Do you need anything else? Are you going to be sick? I assessed my queasy stomach. No. But thanks. Okay. And in her typically brusque way, she left, turning off the lights and shutting the door. I would have thought I'd pass out right away. Honestly, I wanted to. My heart had been opened up to too much of Dimitri tonight, and I wanted that pain to go away. I wanted blackness and oblivion. Instead, maybe because I was a glutton for punishment, my heart decided to finish the job and rip itself completely open. I went to visit Lissa. Chapter 10. Everyone had hit it off so well at lunch with Avery that the group had gotten together again that evening and had kind of a wild time. Lissa was thinking about that as she sat in her first period English class the next morning. They'd stayed up late last night, sneaking out past curfew. The memory brought a smile to Lissa's face, even as she stifled a yawn. I couldn't help but feel a tiny bit of jealousy. I knew Avery was responsible for Lissa's happiness, and that bothered me on a petty level. Yet, Avery's new friendship was also making me feel less guilty about leaving Lissa. Lissa yawned again. It was hard to concentrate on the scarlet letter while fighting a slight hangover. Avery seemed to have a never-ending supply of liquor. Adrian had taken to this right away, but Lissa had been a little more hesitant. She'd abandoned her partying days a long time ago. But she'd finally succumbed last night and drunk more glasses of wine than she really should have. It wasn't unlike my situation with the vodka, ironically enough. Both of us overindulging, despite being miles and miles apart. Suddenly, a high-pitched wail pierced the air. Lissa's head shot up, along with everyone else's in the class. In a corner of the room, a small fire alarm flashed and shrieked its warning. Naturally, some students started cheering while some pretended to be scared. The rest just looked surprised and waited. Lissa's instructor also looked a little caught off guard, and after a quick examination, Lissa decided this wasn't a planned alarm. Teachers usually had a heads-up when there were drills, and Ms. Malloy didn't wear the usual weary expression teachers had when trying to figure out how much time the drill would cut from their lessons. Up and at M, said Ms. Malloy in annoyance, grabbing a clipboard. You know where to go. Fire drill procedure was pretty standard. Lissa followed the others and fell in step with Christian. Did you set this up? She teased. Nope. Wish I had, though. This class is killing me. You? I have the worst headache ever. He gave her a knowing grin. Let that be a lesson to you, little Miss Lush. She made a face in return and gave him a light punch. They reached their class's meeting spot out on the quad and joined in the semblance of a line the others were trying to form. A mess. Malloy arrived and checked everyone off on her clipboard, satisfied no one had been left behind. I don't think this was planned, said Lissa. Agreed, said Christian. Which means even if there's no fire, it might take a while. Well, then. No use waiting around, huh? Christian and Lissa turned around in surprise at the voice behind them and saw Avery. She wore a purple sweater dress and black heels that seemed totally out of place on the wet grass. What are you doing here? Asked Lissa. Figured you'd be in your room. Whatever. It's so boring there. I had to come liberate you guys. You did this? Asked Christian, slightly impressed. Avery shrugged. I told you, I was bored. Now, come on while it's still chaotic. Christian and Lissa exchanged glances. Well, said Lissa slowly, I suppose they did already take attendance. Hurry, said Avery. Her excitement was contagious, and, feeling bold. Lissa hurried after her, Christian in tow. With all the milling students, no one noticed them cutting across the campus until they reached the outside of guest housing. Simon stood leaning against the door, and Lissa stiffened. They were busted. Everything set? Avery asked him. Simon, definitely the strong and silent type, gave a swift nod as his only answer before straightening up. He stuffed his hands into his coat pockets and walked off. Lissa stared in amazement. He just let us go. And is he in on it? Simon wasn't on campus as a teacher, but still, that didn't necessarily mean he'd let students skip out on class because of a faked fire drill. Avery grinned mischievously, watching him go. We've been together for a while. He's got better things to do than babysit us. She led them inside, but instead of going to her room, they cut off to a different section of the building and went somewhere I knew well, Adrian's room. Avery beat on the door. Hey, YAfiction. Open up. Lissa slapped a hand over her mouth to smother her giggles. So much for stealth. Everyone's going to hear you. I need him to hear me, Avery argued. She kept pounding on the door and yelling. And finally, Adrian answered. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He'd drunk twice as much as Lissa last night. What? He blinked. Shouldn't you guys be in class? Oh God. I didn't sleep that much, did I? Let us in, said Avery, pushing past. We've got refugees from a fire here. She flounced onto his couch, making herself at home while he continued staring. Lissa and Christian joined her. Avery sprang the fire alarm, explained Lissa. Nice work, said Adrian, collapsing into a fluffy chair. But why'd you have to come here? Is this the only place that's not burning down? Avery batted her eyelashes at him. Aren't you happy to see us? He eyed her speculatively for a moment. Always happy to see you. Lissa was normally pretty straight-laced about this kind of thing, but something about it amused her. It was so wild, so silly. It was a break from all her recent worries. It's not going to take them that long to figure it out, you know. They could be letting everyone in right now. They could be, agreed Avery, putting her feet up on the coffee table. But I have it on good authority that another alarm is going to go off in the school once they open the doors. How the hell did you manage that? Asked Christian. Top secret. Adrian rubbed his eyes and was clearly amused by this, despite the abrupt wake-up. You can't pull fire alarms all day, Lazar. Actually, I have it on good authority that once they give the all-clear on a second alarm, a third's going to go off. Lissa laughed out loud. Though a lot of it was due more to the guys' reactions and less to Avery's announcement. Christian, in fits of antisocial rebellion, had set people on fire. Adrian spent most of his days drunk and chain-smoking. For a cute society girl like Avery to astonish them, something truly remarkable had to happen. Avery looked very pleased at having outdone them. If the interrogation's over now, she said, aren't you going to offer your guests any refreshments? Adrian stood up and yawned. Fine, fine, you insolent girl. I'll make coffee. With a kick? She inclined her head toward Adrian's liquor cabinet. You have got to be kidding, said Christian. Do you even have a liver left? Avery wandered over to the cabinet and picked up a bottle of something. She held it out to Lissa. You game? Even Lissa's morning rebelliousness had limits. The wine headache still throbbed in her skull. Ugh, no. Cowards, said Avery. She turned back to Adrian. Well then, Mr. Ivashkov, you'd best put on the pot. I always like a little coffee with my brandy. Not long after that, I faded away from Lissa's head and drifted back into my own, returning to the blackness of sleep and ordinary dreams. It was short-lived, however, seeing as a loud pounding soon jerked me into consciousness. My eyes flew open, and a deep, searing pain shot through the back of my skull, the aftereffects of that toxic vodka, no doubt. Lissa's hangover had nothing on mine. I started to close my eyes, wanting to sink back under and let sleep heal the worst of my pain. Then, I heard the pounding again, and worse, my whole bed shook violently. Someone was kicking it. Opening my eyes again, I turned and found myself staring into Yeva's shrewd dark eyes. If Sydney had met many Dampiers like Yeva, I could understand why she thought our race were minions of hell. Pursing her lips, Yeva kicked the bed again. Hey, I cried. I'm awake, okay? Yeva muttered something in Russian, and Paul peered around from behind her, translating. She says you're not awake until you're actually out of bed and standing up. And with no more warning, that sadistic old woman continued kicking the bed. I jerked upright, and the world spun around me. I'd said this before, but this time, I really meant it. I was never going to drink again. No good ever came from it. The covers looked awfully tempting to my agonized body, but a few more kicks from Yeva's pointy-toed boots made me shoot up off the bed. Okay. Are you happy now? I'm up. Yeva's expression didn't change, but at least she stopped with the kicking. I turned to Paul. What's going on? Grandmother says you have to go with her. Where? She says you don't need to know. I started to say that I wasn't following that crazy old wench anywhere, but after one look at her scary face, I thought better of it. I didn't put it past her to be able to turn people into toads. Fine, I said. I'll be ready to go once I shower and change. Paul translated my words, but Yeva shook her head and spoke again. She says there's no time, he explained. We have to go now. Can I at least brush my teeth? She allowed that small concession, but a change of clothes was apparently out of the question. It was just as well. Each step I took made me feel woozy, and I probably would have passed out doing something as complicated as dressing and undressing. The clothes didn't smell or anything either. They were mostly just wrinkled from where I'd fallen asleep in them. When I got downstairs, I saw that no one else was awake except Alina. She was washing leftover dishes from last night and seemed surprised to see me up. That made two of us. It's early for you, isn't it? She asked. I turned and caught sight of the kitchen clock. I gasped. It was only about 4 hours after I'd gone to bed. Good God. Is the sun even up? Amazingly, it was. Alina offered to make me breakfast, but again, Yeva reiterated our time crunch. My stomach seemed to simultaneously want and loathe food, so I couldn't say if abstaining was a good thing or not. Whatever, I said. Let's just go and get this over with. Yeva walked into the living room and returned a few moments later with a large satchel. She handed it to me expectantly. I shrugged and took it, hanging it over one shoulder. It clearly had stuff in it, but it wasn't that heavy. She went back out to the other room and returned with another tote bag. I took this one too and hung it over the same shoulder, balancing both of them. This one was heavier, but my back didn't complain too much. When she left for a third time and returned with a giant box, I started to get irate. What is this? I demanded, taking it from her. It felt like it had bricks in it. Grandmother needs you to carry some things, Paul told me. Yes, I said through gritted teeth. I sort of figured that out 50 pounds ago. Yeva gave me one more box, stacking it on top of the other. It wasn't as heavy, but by this point, it honestly didn't matter. Alina shot me a sympathetic look, shook her head, and returned silently to her dishes, apparently not about to argue with Yeva. Yeva set off after that, and I followed obediently, trying to both hold the boxes and not let the bags fall off my shoulder. It was a heavy load, one my hungover body really didn't want. But I was strong enough that I figured it wouldn't be a problem to get into town or wherever she was leading me. Paul ran along at my side, apparently there to let me know if Yeva found anything along the road she wanted me to carry too. It seemed like spring was charging into Siberia far faster than it ever did into Montana. The sky was clear, and the morning sun was heating things up surprisingly fast. It was hardly summer weather, but it was definitely enough to notice. It would have made very uncomfortable walking weather for a Moroi. "Do you know where we're going?" I asked Paul. "No," he said cheerfully. For someone so old. Yeva could move at a pretty good pace, and I found myself having to hurry to keep up with her with my load. At one point, she glanced back and said something that Paul translated as, "She's kind of surprised that you can't move faster." "Yeah, well, I'm kind of surprised that no one else can carry any of this." He translated again. "She says if you're really such a famous Strigoi killer, then this shouldn't be a problem." I was filled with great relief when downtown came into sight, only we kept walking past it. "Oh, come on," I said. "Where the hell are we going?" Without giving me a backward glance, Yeva rattled off something. "Grandmother says Uncle Dimka never would have complained so much," Paul said. None of this was Paul's fault, he was just the messenger. Yet, every time he spoke, I kind of wanted to kick him. Nonetheless, I kept carrying my burden and didn't say anything else for the rest of the walk. Yeva was right to a certain extent. I was a Strigoi hunter. And it was true that Dimitri would have never complained about some old lady's crazy whims. He would have done his duty patiently. I tried to summon him up in my mind and draw strength from him. I thought about that time in the cabin again, thought about the way his lips had felt on mine and the wonderful scent of his skin when I'd pressed closer to him. I could hear his voice once more, murmuring in my ear that he loved me, that I was beautiful, that I was the only one. Thinking of him didn't take away the discomfort of my journey with Yeva, but it made it a little more bearable. We walked for almost an hour more before reaching a small house, and I was ready to fall over in relief, soaked in sweat. The house was one floor, made of plain, weather-worn brown boards. The windows, however, were surrounded on three sides by exquisite, highly stylized blue shutters overlaid with a white design. It was that same sort of flashy use of color I'd seen on the buildings in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Yeva knocked on the door. At first there was only silence, and I panicked, thinking we'd have to turn right around and head back. Finally, a woman answered the door, a Moroi woman. She was maybe 30, very pretty, with high cheekbones and strawberry blonde hair. She exclaimed in surprise at seeing Yeva, smiling and greeting her in Russian. Glancing over at Paul and me, the woman quickly stepped aside and gestured us in. She switched to English as soon as she realized I was American. All these bilingual people were kind of amazing. It wasn't something I saw very often in the US. She pointed to a table and told me to set everything there, which I did with relief. "My name's Oksana," she said, shaking my hand. "My husband, Mark, is in the garden and should be in soon." "I'm Rose," I told her. Oksana offered us chairs. Mine was wooden and straight-backed, but at that moment, it felt like a down-filled bed. I sighed happily and wiped the sweat off my brow. Meanwhile, Oksana unpacked the things I'd carried. The bags were filled with leftovers from the funeral. The top box contained some dishes and pots. which Paul explained had been borrowed from Oksana some time ago. Oksana finally reached the bottom box, and so help me, it was filled with garden bricks. You have got to be kidding, I said. Across the living room, Yeva looked very smug. Oksana was delighted by the gifts. Oh, Mark will be happy to have these. She smiled at me. It was very sweet of you to carry these that whole way. Happy to help, I said stiffly. The back door opened, and a man walked in. Mark, presumably. He was tall and stockily built, his graying hair indicating an age greater than Oksana's. He washed his hands in the kitchen sink and then turned to join us. I nearly gasped when I saw his face and discovered something stranger than the age difference. He was a damper. For a moment, I wondered if this was someone else and not her husband, Mark. But that was the name Oksana introduced him with, and the truth hit me, a Moroi and damper married couple. Sure. Our two races hooked up all the time. But marriage? It was very scandalous in the Moroi world. I tried to keep the surprise off my face and behave as politely as I could. Oksana and Mark seemed very interested in me, though she did most of the talking. Mark simply watched, curiosity all over his face. My hair was down. So my tattoos couldn't have given away my unpromised status. Maybe he was just wondering how an American girl had found her way out to the middle of nowhere. Maybe he thought I was a new blood whore recruit. By my third glass of water, I began to feel better. It was around that time that Oksana said we should eat, and by then, my stomach was ready for it. Oksana and Mark prepared the food together, dismissing any offers of help. Watching the couple work was fascinating. I had never seen such an efficient team. They never got in each other's way and never needed to talk about what needed doing next. They just knew. Despite the remote location, the kitchen's contents were modern. And Oksana placed a dish of some sort of potato casserole in the microwave. Mark's back was to her while he rummaged in the refrigerator, but as soon as she hit start, he said, "No. It doesn't need to be that long." I blinked in surprise, glancing back and forth between them. He hadn't even seen what time she'd selected. Then I got it. "You're bonded," I exclaimed. Both looked at me in equal surprise. "Yes. Didn't Yeva tell you?" Oksana asked. I shot a quick look at Yeva, who was again wearing that annoyingly self-satisfied look on her face. "No. Yeva hasn't been very forthcoming this morning." "Most everyone around here knows," Oksana said, returning to her work. Then you're a spirit user." That made her pause again. She and Mark exchanged startled looks. "That," she said, "is not something that's widely known. Most people think you haven't specialized, right?" "How did you know?" "Because it was exactly how it had been for Lissa and me. Stories of bonds had always existed in Moroi folklore, but how bonds formed had always been a mystery. It was generally believed they just happened. Like Oksana, Lissa had generally been regarded as a non-specializing Moroi, one who didn't have any special ability with one element. We realized now, of course, that bonding only occurred with spirit users, when they saved the lives of others. Something in Oksana's voice told me she wasn't really all that surprised I knew. I couldn't figure out how she'd realized that, however, and I was too stunned by my discovery to say anything else. Lissa and I had never, ever met another bonded pair. The only such two we knew about were the legendary Vladimir and Anna. And those stories were shrouded by centuries of incomplete history, making it difficult to know fact from fiction. The only other leads we had to the world of spirit were Ms. Carpe, a former teacher who went insane, and Adrian. Until now, he had been our biggest discovery. A spirit user who was more or less stable depending on how you looked at it. When the meal was ready, spirit never came up. Oksana led the conversation, keeping to light topics and jumping between languages. I studied her and Mark as I ate, looking for any signs of instability. I saw none. They seemed like perfectly pleasant, perfectly ordinary people. If I hadn't known what I did, I would have had no reason to suspect anything. Oksana didn't seem depressed or unhinged. Mark hadn't inherited that vile darkness that sometimes seeped into me. My stomach welcomed the food, and the last of my headache faded away. At one point, though, a strange sensation swept through me. It was disorienting, like a fluttering in my head, and a wave of heat and then ice coursing through me. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it came on. And I hoped it'd be the last of that demon vodka's ill effects. We finished eating, and I jumped up to help. Oksana shook her head. No, there's no need. You should go with Mark. Huh? I asked. He dabbed at his face with a napkin and then stood up. Yes. Let's go out to the garden. I started to follow, then paused to glance back at Yeva. I expected her to chastise me for abandoning the dishes. Instead, I found no smug or disapproving looks. Her expression was knowing, almost expectant. Something about it sent a shiver down my back. And I recalled Victoria's words. Yeva had dreamed of my arrival. The garden Mark led me to was much bigger than I expected, enclosed in a thick fence and lined with trees. New leaves hung on them, blocking the worst of the heat. Lots of bushes and flowers were already in bloom, and here and there, young shoots were well on their way to adulthood. It was beautiful. And I wondered if Oksana had had a hand in it. Lissa was able to make plants grow with spirit. Mark gestured me over to a stone bench. We sat down side by side, and silence fell. So, he said. What would you like to know? Wow. You don't waste time. I don't see any point in it. You must have lots of questions. I'll do my best to answer. How did you know? I asked. That I'm shadow-kissed too. You did, right? He nodded. Yeva told us. Okay, that was a surprise. Yeva? She can sense things the rest of us can't. She doesn't always know what she's sensing, however. She only knew there was a strange feel to you, and she'd only ever felt that around one other person. So she brought you to me. Seems like she could have done that without me having to carry a household's worth of stuff. This made him laugh. Don't take it personally. She was testing you. She wanted to see if you're a worthy match for her grandson. What's the point? He's dead now. I nearly choked on the words. True, but for her, it's still important. And, by the way, she does think you're worthy. She has a funny way of showing it. I mean, aside from bringing me to meet you, I guess. He laughed again. Even without her. Oksana would have known what you are as soon as she met you. Being shadow-kissed has an effect on the aura. So she can see auras too, I murmured. What else can she do? She must be able to heal. Or you wouldn't be shadow-kissed. Does she have super compulsion? Can she walk dreams? That caught him off guard. Her compulsion is strong, yes, but what do you mean, walk dreams? Like, she'd be able to enter someone else's mind when they're asleep. Anyone's mind, not just yours. Then they could have conversations, just as if they were together. My friend can do it. Mark's expression told me that was news to him. Your friend? Your bondmate? Bondmate? I'd never heard that term. It was weird sounding, but it made sense. No, another spirit user. Another? How many do you know? 3, technically. Well, for now, counting Oksana. Mark turned away, staring absent-mindedly at a cluster of pink flowers. That many, that's incredible. I've only met one other spirit user, and that was years ago. He too was bonded to his guardian. That guardian died, and it ripped him apart. He still helped us when Oksana and I were trying to figure things out. I braced myself for my own death all the time, and I feared for Lissa's. Yet it had never occurred to me just what it would be like with a bond. How would it affect the other person? What would it be like to have a gaping hole where once you'd been intimately linked to someone else? He never mentioned walking dreams either, Mark continued. He chuckled again, friendly lines crinkling up around his blue eyes. Back in the U.S. I didn't have to elaborate, but somehow, I needed to tell him the whole truth. I left her. He frowned. Left as in, you simply traveled? Or left as in you abandoned her? Abandoned. The word was like a slap in the face, and suddenly, all I could envision was that last day I'd seen her, when I'd left her crying. I had things to do, I said evasively. Yes, I know. Oksana told me. Told you what? Now he hesitated. She shouldn't have done it. She tries not to. Done what? I exclaimed, uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. Well, she brushed your mind. During brunch. I thought back and suddenly recalled the tickling in my head, the heat rolling over me. What does that mean exactly? An aura can tell a spirit user about someone's personality. But Oksana can also dig further, reaching in and actually reading more specific information about a person. Sometimes she can tie that ability into compulsion, but the results are very, very powerful. And wrong. It's not right to do that to someone you have no bond with. It took me a moment to process that. Neither Lissa nor Adrian could read the thoughts of others. The closest Adrian could come to someone's mind was the dream walking. Lissa couldn't do that. Not even for me. I could feel her, but the opposite wasn't true. Oksana could feel, oh, I don't know how to explain it. There's a recklessness in you. You're on some sort of quest. There's vengeance written all over your soul. He suddenly reached over and lifted my hair up, peering at my neck. Just as I thought. You're unpromised. I jerked my head back. Why is that such a big deal? That whole town back there is filled with Dampiers who aren't guardians. I still thought Mark was a nice guy, but being preached to always irritated me. Yes. But they've chosen to settle down. You, and others like you become vigilantes of sorts. You're obsessed with hunting Strigoi on your own. With personally setting out to right the wrongs that whole race has brought down upon us. That can only lead to trouble. I see it all the time. All the time? I asked, startled. Why do you think guardian numbers are dwindling? They're leaving to have homes and families. Or they're going off like you. Still fighting but answering to no one unless they're hired to be bodyguards or Strigoi hunters. Dampiers for hire. I suddenly began to understand how a non-royal like Abe had gotten his bodyguards. Money could make anything happen, I supposed. I've never heard of anything like that. Of course not. You think the Moroi and other guardians want that widely known? Want to dangle that in front of you as an option? I don't see what's so wrong with Strigoi hunting. We're always defensive, not offensive, when it comes to Strigoi. Maybe if more Dampiers set out after them, they wouldn't be such a problem. Perhaps. But there are different ways of going about that, some better than others. And when you're going out like you are with a heart filled with sorrow and revenge? That's not one of the better ways. It'll make you sloppy. And the shadow-kissed darkness will just complicate things. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared stonily ahead. Yeah, well, it's not like I can do much about that. He turned to me, expression surprised once more. Why don't you just have your bond-mate heal the darkness out of you? Chapter 11. I stared at Mark for several long seconds. Finally, stupidly, I asked, did you say, heal? Mark stared at me in equal surprise. Yes, of course. She can heal other things, right? Why not this? Because, I frowned. That doesn't make any sense. The darkness, all the bad side effects, those come from Lissa. If she could just heal it, why wouldn't she heal it out of herself? Because when it's in her, it's too ingrained. Too tied into her being. She can't heal it the way she can other things. But once your bond has pulled it into you, it's like any other sickness. My heart was pounding in my chest. What he was suggesting was too ridiculously easy. No, it was just ridiculous, period. There was no way after all that we'd been through that Lissa could heal that rage and depression the way she could a cold or a broken leg. Viktor Dashkov, despite his wicked schemes, had known an astonishing amount about spirit and had explained it to us. The other four elements were more physical in nature, but spirit came from the mind and soul. To use that much mental energy to be able to do such powerful things couldn't be done without devastating side effects. We'd been fighting those side effects from the beginning. First in Lissa and then in me. They couldn't just go away. If that were possible, I said quietly, then everyone would have done it. Ms. Karp wouldn't have lost her mind. Anna wouldn't have committed suicide. What you're saying is too easy. Mark didn't know who I was talking about, but clearly it didn't matter for what he wanted to express. You're right. It's not easy at all. It requires a careful balance, a circle of trust and strength between two people. It took Oksana and me a long time to learn, many hard years. His face darkened. And I could only imagine what those years had been like. My short time with Lissa had been bad enough. They'd had to live with this a lot longer than we had. It had to have been unbearable at times. Slowly, wonderingly, I dared to give credence to his words. But now you guys are okay? There was a flicker of a wry smile on his lips. I'd hardly say we're perfectly okay. There's only so much she can do, but it makes life manageable. She spaces out the healings as long as we can handle it, since it takes a lot out of her. It's draining, and it limits her overall power. What do you mean? He shrugged. She can still do the other things, healing, compulsion, but not to the levels she would if she wasn't always healing me. My hope faltered. Oh. Then. I couldn't. I couldn't do that to Lissa. Compared to what she's doing to you. Rose. I have a feeling she'd think it was a fair trade. I thought back to our last meeting. I thought about how I'd left her there, despite her begging. I thought about the lows she'd been experiencing in my absence. I thought about how she'd refused to heal Dimitri when I'd thought there might still be hope for him. We'd both been bad friends. I shook my head. I don't know, I said in a small voice. I don't know if she would. Mark gave me a long, level look, but he didn't push me on the matter. He glanced up at the sun, almost as if he could tell the time from it. He probably could. He had that surviving in the wilderness kind of feel to him. The others will wonder what happened to us. Before we go, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, plain silver ring. Learning to heal will take time. What worries me the most right now is this vigilante mood you're in. The darkness is only going to make it worse. Take this. He extended the ring to me. I hesitated and then reached for it. What is it? Oksana infused it with spirit. It's a healing charm. Once again, shock ran through me. Moroi charmed objects with elements all the time. Stakes were charmed with all four of the physical elements, making them lethal to Strigoi. Viktor had charmed a necklace with earth magic, using the base nature of earth to turn the necklace into a lust charm. Even Sydney's tattoo was a charm of sorts. I suppose there was no reason that spirit couldn't charm objects too. But it had never occurred to me, probably because Lissa's powers were still too new and too foreign. What's it do? I mean, what kind of healing? It'll help with your moods. It can't get rid of them, but it'll lessen them, help you think more clearly. Might keep you out of trouble. Oksana makes these for me to help between healings. I started to slip it on. But he shook his head. Save it for when you really feel out of control. The magic won't last forever. It fades just like any other charm. I stared at the ring. My mind suddenly opened to all sorts of new possibilities. A few moments later, I slipped it into my coat pocket. Paul stuck his head out the back door. Grandmother wants to leave now, he told me. She wants to know why you're taking so long and said to ask why you'd make someone as old as her keep waiting and suffering with her back. I recalled how fast Yeva had been walking while I struggled to keep up with my load. Her back hadn't seemed all that bad to me, but again. I remembered that Paul was only the messenger and spared him my commentary. Okay. I'll be right there. When he was gone, I shook my head. It's hard being worthy. I moved toward the door. Then gave Mark a backward glance, as a random thought occurred to me. You're telling me that going off on your own is bad, but you aren't a guardian either. He smiled at me again, one of those sad, wry smiles. I used to be. Then Oksana saved my life. We bonded and eventually fell in love. I couldn't stand to be separated from her after that, and the guardians would have assigned me elsewhere. I had to go. Was it hard to leave them? Very. Our age difference made it even more scandalous. A strange chill ran through me. Mark and Oksana were the embodiment of the two halves of my life. They fought against a shadow-kissed bond as Lissa and I did, and also faced the same condemnation for their relationship that Dimitri and I had. Mark continued, but sometimes we have to listen to our hearts. And even though I left, I'm not out there recklessly going after Strigoi. I'm an old man living with the woman he loves and tending his garden. There's a difference, don't forget that. My mind was reeling when I returned to the Belaikov house. Without the bricks, the walk back had been a lot easier. It had given me a chance to ponder Mark's words. I felt like I'd received a lifetime of information in a 1-hour conversation. Alina was going about the house, doing her normal tasks of cooking and cleaning. While I would personally never want to spend my days doing those sorts of domestic duties, I had to admit there was something comforting about always having someone who was around, ready to cook and worry about me on a daily basis. I knew it was a purely selfish desire. Just as I knew my own mom was doing important things with her life. I shouldn't judge her. Still, it made me feel warm and cared for to have Alina treat me like a daughter when she hardly knew me. "Are you hungry?" she asked automatically. I think one of the greatest fears in her life was that someone might go hungry in her home. Sydney's perpetual lack of appetite had been a non-stop worry for Alina. I hid a smile. "No, we ate at Mark and Oksana's." "Ah, that's where you were? They're good people. Where is everyone?" I asked. The house was unusually quiet. Sonia and Carolina are at work. Victoria's out at a friend's, but she'll be glad you're back. What about Sydney? She left a little while ago. She said she was going back to St. Petersburg. What? I exclaimed. Left for good? Just like that? Sydney had a blunt nature, but this was abrupt even for her. The alchemists, well, they're always on the move. Alina handed me a piece of paper. She left this for you. I took the note and immediately opened it. Sydney's handwriting was neat and precise. Somehow this didn't surprise me. Rose. I'm sorry I had to leave so quickly, but when the alchemists tell me to jump, well, I jump. I've hitched a ride back to that farm town we stayed in so that I can pick up the Red Hurricane, and then I'm off to St. Petersburg. Apparently, now that you've been delivered to Bea, they don't need me to stick around anymore. I wish I could tell you more about Abe and what he wants from you. Even if I was allowed to, there isn't much to say. In some ways, he's as much a mystery to me as he is to you. Like I said, a lot of the business he deals in is illegal both among humans and Moroi. The only time he gets directly involved with people is when something relates to that business or if it's a very, very special case. I think you're one of those cases. And even if he doesn't intend you harm, he might want to use you for his own purposes. It could be as simple as him wanting to contract you as a bodyguard, seeing as you're rogue. Maybe he wants to use you to get to others. Maybe this is all part of someone else's plan, someone who's even more mysterious than him. Maybe he's doing someone a favor. Zmei can be dangerous or kind. All depending on what he needs to accomplish. I never thought I'd care enough to say this to a damper, but be careful. I don't know what your plans are now. But I have a feeling trouble follows you around. Call me if there's anything I can help with, but if you go back to the big cities to hunt Strigoi, don't leave any more bodies unattended. All the best. Sydney. P.S. The Red Hurricane is what I named the car. P.P.S. Just because I like you, it doesn't mean I still don't think you're an evil creature of the night. You are. Her cell phone number was added at the bottom, and I couldn't help but smile. Since we'd ridden to Bea with Abe and his guardians, Sydney had had to leave the car behind. Which had traumatized her almost as much as the Strigoi. I hoped the alchemists would let her keep it. I shook my head, amused in spite of her warnings about Abe. The Red Hurricane. As I headed upstairs to my room, my smile faded. Despite her abrasive attitude, I was going to miss Sydney. She might not exactly be a friend, or was she, but in this brief time, I'd come to regard her as a constant in my life. I didn't have many of those left anymore. I felt adrift, unsure what to do now. I'd come here to bring peace to Dimitri and had only ended up bringing grief to his family. And if what everyone said was true, I wasn't going to find many Strigoi here in Bea. Somehow, I couldn't picture Dimitri, wandering the road and farms for the occasional prey. Even as a Strigoi, and it killed me to think those words Dimitri would have a purpose. If he wasn't returning to the familiar sights of his hometown, then he would be doing something else meaningful inasmuch as a Strigoi could. Sydney's comment in the note had verified what I kept hearing over and over. Strigoi were in the cities. But which one? Where would Dimitri go? Now I was the one without a purpose. On top of it all, I couldn't help but replay Mark's words. Was I really on an insane vigilante mission? Was I foolishly rushing to my death? Or was I foolishly rushing into nothing? Was I doomed to spend the rest of my days wandering? Alone? Sitting on my bed, I felt my mood plummet and knew I had to distract myself. I was too susceptible to dark emotions. As long as Lissa used spirit, I didn't need to further encourage them. I slipped on the ring that Mark had given me, hoping it would bring some sort of clarity and tranquility. I felt no noticeable difference, though, and decided to seek peace from that same place I always did, Lissa's mind. She was with Adrian. And the two were practicing spirit again. After some initial bumps in the road, Adrian was proving a quick study at healing. That had been the first of Lissa's powers to manifest. And it always irked her that he made more progress on what she had to teach him than vice versa. I'm running out of things for you to heal, she said, setting some tiny potted plants onto a table. Unless we start cutting off limbs or something. Adrian smiled. I used to tease Rose about that, how I was going to impress her by healing amputees or something equally absurd. Oh. And I'm sure she had a smart-ass response for you each time. Yes, she did. His face was fond as he recalled the memory. There was a part of me that was always insanely curious to hear them talk about me, yet at the same time, I always felt bad at the grief my name seemed to invoke. Lissa groaned and stretched out on the carpeted floor. They were in a dorm lounge, and curfew was swiftly approaching. I want to talk to her, Adrian. You can't, he said. There was an unusual seriousness in his voice. I know she still checks in on you, that's the closest you'll get to talking to her. And honestly, that's not so bad. You can tell her exactly how you feel. Yeah, but I want to hear her talk back like you do in your dreams. This made him smile again. She does plenty of talking back, believe me. Lissa sat up straight. Do it now. Do what now? Go visit her dreams. You always try to explain it to me, but I've never actually seen it. Let me watch. He stared, at a loss for words. That's kind of voyeuristic. Adrian. I want to learn this, and we've tried everything else. I can feel the magic around you sometimes. Just do it, okay? He started to protest again but then bit off his comment after studying her face for a moment. Her words had been sharp and demanding, very uncharacteristic for her. Okay. I'll try. The whole idea of Adrian trying to get into my head while I was watching him through Lissa's head was surreal, to say the least. I didn't quite know what to expect from him. I'd always wondered if he had to be asleep or at least have his eyes closed. Apparently not. He instead stared off at nothing, his eyes going vacant as his mind left the world around him. Through Lissa's eyes, I could see some of the magic radiating off him and his aura, and she tried to analyze each strand. Then, without warning, all the magic faded. He blinked and shook his head. Sorry. I can't do it. Why not? Probably because she's awake. Did you learn anything by watching? A little. Probably would have been more useful if you'd actually made the connection. Again. Lissa had that petulant tone. She could be anywhere in the world, you know, on any schedule. His words were smothered by a yawn. Maybe we can try at different times of the day. I've been getting her, actually, close to this time. Or sometimes I catch her really early in the day. She could be close by then, said Lissa. Or on a human daylight schedule in some other part of the world. Her enthusiasm dropped. Right. That too. How come you guys never look like you're working? Christian strolled into the room. Looking amused at Lissa sitting on the floor and Adrian sprawling on the couch. Standing behind Christian was someone I hadn't thought I'd see anytime soon. Adrian, who could detect women a mile away. Also immediately noticed the newcomer. Where'd you get the jailbait? He asked. Christian shot Adrian a warning look. This is Jill. Jill Mastrano allowed herself to be nudged forward. Her light green eyes impossibly wide as she looked around. Jill, this is Lissa and Adrian. Jill was one of the last people I'd expected to see here. I'd met her a little over a month ago. She was in 9th grade, which meant she'd be here on the upper campus in the fall. She had the same super slim build that most Moroi had, but it was paired with height that was impressive even by vampiric standards. It made her look rail thin. Her hair fell in light brown curls to the middle of her back and would be beautiful when she learned how to style it properly. For now, it was kind of messy. And her overall impression while cute was kind of awkward. Hi, she said, looking from face to face. As far as she was concerned, these were Moroi Gold Star celebrities. She'd nearly passed out when she first met me and Dimitri, thanks to our reputations. From her expression, she was in a similar state now. Jill wants to learn how to use her power for good instead of evil, said Christian with an exaggerated wink. That was his coy way of saying Jill wanted to learn how to fight with her magic. She'd expressed the interest to me, and I'd told her to find Christian. I was glad she'd had the courage to take me up on my advice. Christian was a campus celebrity too, albeit an infamous one. Another recruit? Asked Lissa, shaking her head. Think you'll keep this one around? Jill gave Christian a startled look. What's that mean? After the attack. Lots of people said they wanted to learn to fight with magic, Christian explained. So they found me, and we worked together, once or twice. Then everyone faded away once it got hard. And they realized they had to keep practicing. It doesn't help that you're a mean teacher, pointed out Lissa. And so now you've got to recruit among children, said Adrian solemnly. Hey! Said Jill indignantly. I'm 14. Immediately, she flushed at having spoken so boldly to him. He found it amusing, as he did so many other things. My mistake, he said. What's your element? Water. Fire and water, huh? Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill. He snapped it out straight. Sweetheart, I'll make you a deal. If you can make a bucket of water appear and dump over Christian's head, I'll give you this. I'll add in 10, laughed Lissa. Jill looked stunned. But I suspected it was because Adrian had called her sweetheart. I took Adrian for granted so often that it was easy to forget he really was a hot guy. Christian pushed Jill toward the door. Ignore them. They're just jealous because spirit users can't go charging into battle like we can. He knelt down to Lissa's height on the floor and gave her a quick kiss. We were practicing in the lounge upstairs, but I've got to walk her back now. I'll see you tomorrow. You don't have to, said Jill. I can get back there fine. I don't want to be any trouble. Adrian stood up. You aren't. If anyone's going to step up and be the knight in shining armor here, it might as well be me. I'll take you back and leave the lovebirds to their lovebirding. He gave Jill a grand bow. Shall we? Adrian said Lissa, a sharp note in her voice. Oh, come on, he said, rolling his eyes. I've got to head back anyway. You guys are of no use once curfew comes. And honestly, give me some credit here. Even I have boundaries. He gave Lissa a meaningful look. One that told her she was an idiot for thinking he was going to hit on Jill. Lissa held his gaze for a few moments and realized he was right. Adrian was a scoundrel at times and had never made his interest in me a secret, but walking Jill home wasn't part of some grand seduction. He really was just being nice. All right, said Lissa. I'll see you later. Nice meeting you, Jill. You too, said Jill. She dared a smile at Christian. Thanks again. You better show up for our next practice, he warned. Adrian and Jill started to step out the door, just as Avery stepped through it. Hey, Adrian. Avery gave Jill a once-over. Who's your jailbait? Will you guys stop calling me that? Exclaimed Jill. Adrian pointed at Avery chastisingly. Hush. I'll deal with you later, Lazar. I certainly hope so, she said in a sing-song voice. I'll leave the door unlocked. Jill and Adrian left, and Avery sat down next to Lissa. She seemed animated enough to be drunk, but Lissa smelled no liquor on her. Lissa was rapidly learning that some part of Avery was always just vivacious and carefree, regardless of intoxication. Did you really just invite Adrian to your room later? Asked Lissa. She spoke teasingly but had been secretly wondering if something was going on between them. And yeah, that made two of us who wondered. Avery shrugged. I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes we hang out once you guys are all tucked into bed. You aren't going to get jealous, are you? No, laughed Lissa. Just curious. Adrian's a good guy. Oh? Asked Christian. Define good. Avery held up her hand and began ticking items off with each finger. He's devastatingly handsome, funny, rich, related to the Queen. You got your wedding colors picked out? Asked Lissa, still laughing. Not yet, said Avery. I'm still testing the waters. I figured he'd be an easy notch on the Avery Lazar belt, but he's kind of hard to read. I really don't want to be hearing this, Christian said. Sometimes he acts like a love M and leave M type. Other times, he mopes like some heartbroken romantic. Lissa exchanged a knowing glance with Christian that Avery didn't catch while talking. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about him. I'm here to talk about you and me busting out of here. Avery threw her arm around Lissa, who nearly fell over. Out of where? The dorm? No. This school. We're going off on a wild weekend to the Royal Court. What, this weekend? Lissa felt like she was 3 steps behind, and I didn't blame her. Why? Because it's Easter. And Her Royal Majesty thought it would be lovely if you could join her for the holiday. Avery's tone was grand and high-pitched. And, since I've been hanging out with you, Dad's decided I'm on good behavior now. Poor oblivious bastard, murmured Christian. So he said I can go with you. Avery glanced at Christian. You can too, I guess. The Queen said Lissa could bring a guest in addition to me, of course. Lissa looked into Avery's radiant face and didn't share her enthusiasm. I hate going to court. Tatiana just goes on, giving what she thinks is useful advice for me. It's always boring and miserable now. Lissa didn't add that she'd once found court fun when I'd gone with her. That's because you haven't gone with me yet. It'll be a blast. I know where all the good stuff is. And I bet Adrian will come too. He can push his way into anything. It'll be like a double date. Slowly, Lissa began to acknowledge that this might be fun. She and I had managed to find a little of the good stuff that hid underneath the polished surface of court life. Every other visit since had been just as she described, stuffy and businesslike. But now, going with Christian and wild, spontaneous Avery? That had potential. Until Christian ruined it. Well, don't count me in, he said. If you can only bring one person, bring Jill. Who? Asked Avery. Jailbait, explained Lissa. She looked at Christian in astonishment. Why on earth would I bring Jill? I just met her. Because she's actually serious about learning to defend herself. You should introduce her to Mia. They're both water users. Right, said Lissa knowingly. And the fact that you hate it at court has nothing to do with it? Well. Christian. Lissa was suddenly getting upset. Why can't you do this for me? Because I hate the way Queen Bitch looks at me, he said. Lissa didn't find this convincing. Yeah, but when we graduate, I'll be living there. You'll have to go then. Yeah, well. Then give me this small vacation first. Lissa's irritation grew. Oh, I see how it is. I have to put up with your crap all the time, but you can't go out of your way for me. Avery glanced between them and then stood up. I'll leave you kids to work this out on your own. I don't care whether Christian or Jailbait goes, as long as you're there. She peered down at Lissa. You are going, right? Yeah. I'll go. If anything, Christian's refusal had suddenly spurred Lissa more. Avery grinned. Awesome. I'm going to head out of here. But you two had better kiss and make up when I'm gone. Avery's brother Reed suddenly appeared in the doorway. Are you ready? He asked her. Every time he spoke. It always came out as sort of a grunt. Avery flashed the others a triumphant look. See? My gallant brother, coming to walk me back before those dorm matrons start yelling at me to leave. Now Adrian will have to find a new and exciting way to prove his chivalry. Reed didn't look very gallant or chivalrous, but I supposed it was nice of him to come walk her back to her room. His timing had been eerily perfect. Maybe she was right about him not being as bad as people always thought. As soon as Avery was gone, Lissa turned on Christian. "Are you really serious about me bringing Jill instead of you?" "Yep," said Christian. He tried to lie back into her lap, but she pushed him away. "But I'll count the seconds until you return." "I can't believe you think this is a joke." "I don't," he said. "Look, I didn't mean to get you all worked up, okay? But really, I just don't want to deal with all that court drama. And it would be good for Jill." He frowned. "You don't have anything against her, do you?" "I don't even know her," said Lissa. She was still upset, more so than I would have expected, which was odd. Christian caught hold of Lissa's hands, face serious. Those blue eyes she loved softened her anger a little. "Please, I'm not trying to upset you. If it's really that important." "Like that?" Lissa's anger diffused. It was abrupt, like a switch. "No, no. I'm fine bringing Jill, though I'm not sure she should be hanging out with us and doing whatever Avery has in mind. Give Jill to Mia. She'll look after her for the weekend." Lissa nodded, wondering why he was so interested in Jill. "Okay. But you're not doing this because you don't like Avery, are you?" "No, I like Avery. She makes you smile more." "You make me smile. That's why I added on the more." Christian gently kissed Lissa's hand. "You've been so sad since Rose left. I'm glad you're hanging out with someone else, I mean, not that you can't get everything you need from me." "Avery's not a Rose replacement," said Lissa quickly. "I know. But she reminds me of her." "What?" "They have nothing in common." Christian straightened up and sat beside her, resting his face against her shoulder. "Avery's like how Rose used to be, back before you guys left." Both Lissa and I paused to ponder that. Was he right? Before Lissa's spirit powers had begun showing, she and I had lived a party girl lifestyle. And yes, half the time I was the one coming up with the crazy ideas to find a good time and get us into trouble. But had I been as out there as Avery seemed sometimes? "There'll never be another Rose," said Lissa sadly. "No," agreed Christian. He gave her a brief, soft kiss on the mouth. "But there will be other friends." I knew he was right. But I couldn't help but feel a small stab of jealousy. I also couldn't help feel a small amount of worry. Lissa's brief spurt of irritation had been kind of out of the blue. I could understand her wishing Christian could go, but her attitude had been a little bitchy and her almost jealous worry over Jill was weird too. Lissa had no reason to doubt Christian's feelings. Certainly not over someone like Jill. Lissa's moodiness reminded me too much of the old days. Most likely she was overtired. But some instinct, maybe it was part of the bonding, told me something was wrong. It was a fleeting sensation, one I couldn't quite get a hold of, like water slipping through my fingers. Still, my instincts had been right before, and I decided I'd be checking in on Lissa more frequently. Chapter 12. Being with Lissa left me with more questions than answers. And so, without a course of action, I simply continued to stay with the Belikovs for the next few days. I fell into their normal routine, again surprised by how easy it was. I tried hard to make myself useful, doing any chores they'd let me do and even going so far as watching the baby, something I wasn't entirely comfortable with. Seeing as guardian training hadn't left much time for after-school jobs like babysitting. Yeva eyed me the whole time, never saying anything but always looking like she disapproved. I wasn't sure if she wanted me to go or if that was simply the way she always looked. The others, however, didn't question me at all. They were delighted to have me around and made it obvious in every action. Victoria was especially happy. "I wish you could come back to school with us," Victoria said wistfully one evening. She and I had been spending a lot of time together. "When do you go back?" "Monday, right after Easter." I felt a little sadness stir in me. Whether I was still here or not, I would miss her. Oh. Man. I didn't realize it was so soon. A small silence fell between us, then she gave me a sidelong look. Have you maybe thought about coming back to St. Basil's with us? I stared. St. Basil's? Your school is named after a saint too? Not all of them were. Adrian had attended an East Coast school called Alder. Ours is a human saint, she said with a grin. You could enroll there. You could finish your last year. I am sure they'd take you. Of all the crazy options I'd considered on this trip, and believe me, I'd considered a lot of crazy things, that was one that had never crossed my mind. I'd written school off. I was pretty sure there was nothing else I could learn well, after meeting Sydney and Mark. It had become obvious there were still a few more things. Considering what I wanted to do with my life, however, I didn't think another semester of math and science would do much for me. And as far as guardian training went, mostly all I had left to do was prepare for the end-of-year trials. I somehow doubted those tests and challenges would even come remotely close to what I'd experienced with Strigoi already. I shook my head. I don't think so. I think I'm pretty much done with school. Besides, it'd all be in Russian. They'd translate for you. A mischievous grin lit her face. Besides, kicking and punching transcend language. Her smile faded to a more thoughtful expression. But seriously, if you aren't going to finish school, and you aren't going to be a guardian, well, why don't you stay here? I mean, just in Baya. You could live with us. I'm not going to be a blood whore, I said immediately. An odd look crossed her face. That's not what I meant. I shouldn't have said that. Sorry. I felt bad about the comment. While I kept hearing rumors about blood whores in town, I'd only seen one or two, and certainly the Belikov women weren't among them. Sonia's pregnancy was something of a mystery. But working in a drugstore didn't seem that sordid. I'd learned a little bit more about Karolina's situation. The father of her children was a Moroi she apparently had a genuine connection with. She hadn't cheapened herself to be with him, and he hadn't used her. After the baby was born, the two of them had decided to part ways, but it had been friendly. Karolina was now apparently dating a guardian who visited whenever he had leave. The few blood whores I had seen around town very much fit my stereotype. Their clothing and makeup screamed easy sex. The bruises on their necks clearly showed that they had no problem with letting their partners drink blood during sex, which was pretty much the sleaziest thing a damper could do. Only humans gave blood to Moroi. My race didn't. To allow it, particularly during sexual activities, well, like I said, it was sleazy. The dirtiest of the dirty. Mother would love it if you stayed. You could get a job too. Just be part of our family. I can't take Dimitri's place, Victoria, I said softly. She reached out and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I know. No one expects you to. We like you for you, Rose. You being here just feels right. There's a reason Dimka chose to be with you. You fit in here. I tried to imagine the life she described. It sounded easy. Comfortable. No worries. Just living with a loving family, laughing and hanging out together each night. I could go about my own life, not having to trail someone else all day. I would have sisters. There'd be no fighting unless it was to defend. I could give up this plan to kill Dimitri, which I knew would kill me too, either physically or spiritually. I could choose the rational path. Let him go and accept him as dead. And, yet, if I did that, why not just go back to Montana? Back to Lissa and the academy? I don't know, I told Victoria at last. I don't know what I'm going to do. It was just after dinner, and she glanced hesitantly at the clock. I don't want to leave you since we don't have much time together, but I was supposed to meet someone soon. Nikolai? I teased. She shook her head, and I tried to hide my disappointment. I'd seen him a few times, and he'd grown more and more likable. It was too bad Victoria couldn't kindle any feelings for him. Now, though, I wondered if there might be something holding her back, or rather, someone. "Oh, Spill," I said with a grin. "Who is he?" She kept her face blank in a fair imitation of Dimitri's. "A friend," she said evasively. But I thought I saw a smile in her eyes. "Someone at school?" "No," she sighed. "And that's the problem. I'm going to miss him so much." My smile faded. "I can imagine." "Oh." She looked embarrassed. "That's stupid of me. My problems, well, they're nothing compared to yours. I mean, I may not see him for a while, but I will see him." "But Dimitri's gone. You won't see him ever again." Well, that might not be entirely true. I didn't tell her that, though. Instead, I just said, "Yeah." To my surprise, she gave me a hug. "I know what love's like. To lose that. I don't know. I don't know what to say. All I can tell you is that we're here for you. All of us, okay? You can't replace Dimitri. But you do feel like a sister." Her calling me a sister both stunned and warmed me at the same time. She had to go get ready for her date after that. She hurriedly changed clothes and put on makeup. Definitely more than a friend, I decided, and headed out the door. I was kind of glad, because I didn't want her to see the tears that her words had brought to my eyes. I'd spent my life as an only child. Lissa had been the closest I had to a sister. I'd always thought of Lissa as one I'd now lost. To hear Victoria call me a sister now, well, it stirred something in me. Something that told me I really did have friends and wasn't alone. I headed down to the kitchen after that, and Alina soon joined me. I was rummaging for food. "Was that Victoria I heard leave?" she asked. "Yeah, she went off to see a friend." To my credit, I kept my expression neutral. No way would I sell Victoria out. Alina sighed. "I'd wanted her to run an errand for me in town." "I'll do it," I said eagerly. "After I grab something to eat." She gave me a kind smile and patted my cheek. "You have a good heart, Rose. I can see why Dimka loved you." It was so amazing, I thought, how accepted my relationship with Dimitri was around here. No one brought up age or teacher-student relationships. As I'd told Sydney, it was like I was his widow or something, and Victoria's words about me staying replayed in my head. The way Alina looked at me made me feel like I really was her daughter, and once more, I experienced those traitorous feelings about my own mom. She probably would have scoffed at me and Dimitri. She would have called it inappropriate and said I was too young. Or would she have? Maybe I was being too harsh. Seeing me in front of the open cupboard, Alina shook her head reproachfully. "But you need to eat first." "Just a snack," I assured her. "Don't go to any trouble." She ended up slicing me off big pieces of black bread she'd baked earlier that day and put out a tub of butter because she knew I loved to slather up my slices. Carolina had teased me that Americans might be shocked to know what was in this bread, so I never asked any questions. It was somehow sweet and tangy at the same time, and I loved it. Alina sat down across from me and watched me eat. This was his favorite when he was little. "Dimitri's?" She nodded. "Whenever he was on break from school, the first thing he'd do is ask for that bread. I practically had to make him his own loaf each time with the way he ate. The girls never ate that much. Guys always seemed to eat more. Admittedly, I could keep up with most of them. And he's bigger and taller than most." "True," she mused. "But I eventually reached a point where I made him start making it himself. I told him if he was going to eat all my food, he'd best know how much work went into it." I laughed. I can't imagine Dimitri baking bread. And yet, as soon as the words came out, I reconsidered. My immediate associations with Dimitri were always intense and fierce. It was his sexy, battle god persona that came to mind. Yet, it had been Dimitri's gentleness and thoughtfulness mixed with that deadliness that made him so wonderful. The same hands that wielded stakes with such precision would carefully brush the hair out of my face. The eyes that could astutely spot any danger in the area would regard me wonderingly and worshipfully, like I was the most beautiful and amazing woman in the world. I sighed, consumed by that bittersweet ache in my chest that had become so familiar now. What a stupid thing, getting worked up over a loaf of bread of all things. But that was how it was. I got emotional whenever I thought about Dimitri. Alina's eyes were on me, sweet and compassionate. "I know," she said, guessing my thoughts. "I know exactly how you feel. Does it get easier?" I asked. Unlike Sydney, Alina had an answer. "Yes. But you'll never be the same." I didn't know whether to take comfort from those words or not. After I finished eating, she gave me a brief grocery list, and I set off toward downtown, happy to be outside and moving. Inactivity didn't suit me. While in the grocery store, I was surprised to run into Mark. I'd gotten the impression he and Oksana didn't come to town that often. I wouldn't have put it past them to grow their own food and live off the land. He gave me a warm smile. "I wondered if you were still around." "Yeah." I held up my basket. "Just doing some shopping for Alina." "I'm glad you're still here," he said. "You seem more at peace. Your ring is helping. I think. At least with the peace. It hasn't done much as far as any decision-making goes." He frowned, shifting the milk he held in one arm to the other. "What decisions? What to do now? Where to go? Why not stay here?" It was eerie, so similar to the conversation I'd had with Victoria. And my response was equally similar. "I don't know what I'd do if I stayed here. Get a job. Live with the Belikovs. They love you, you know. You fit right in with their family." That warm, loved feeling came back, and I again tried to imagine myself just settling down with them. Working in a store like this or waiting tables. "I don't know," I said. I was a broken record. "I just don't know if that's right for me." "Better than the alternative," he warned. "Better than running off with no real purpose, throwing yourself in the face of danger. That's no choice at all." And yet, it was the reason I'd come to Siberia in the first place. My inner voice scolded me. "Dimitri, Rose. Have you forgotten Dimitri? Have you forgotten how you came here to free him, like he would have wanted? Or was that really what he would have wanted? Maybe he would have wanted me to stay safe. I just didn't know, and with no more help from Mason, my choices were even more muddled." Thinking of Mason suddenly reminded me of something I'd totally forgotten. When we talked before, well, we talked about what Lisa and Oksana could do. "But what about you?" Mark narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean? Have you ever run into, ghosts?" Several moments passed, and then he exhaled. "I'd hoped that wouldn't happen to you." It astonished me then how much relief I felt to know I wasn't alone in my ghostly experiences. Even though I now understood that having died and been to the world of the dead made me a target for spirits, it was still one of the freakiest things about being shadow-kissed. "Did it happen without you wanting it?" I asked. "At first. Then I learned to control it." "Me too." I suddenly recalled the barn. "Actually, that's not entirely true." Lowering my voice further, I hastily recapped what had happened on my trip here with Sydney. I'd never spoken of it to anyone. "You must never, ever do that again," he said sternly. "But I didn't mean to. It just happened. You panicked. You needed help, and some part of you called out to the spirits around you. Don't do it. It's not right, and it's easy to lose control. I don't even know how I did it. Like I said, lapse of control. Don't ever let your panic get the best of you. An older woman passed us, a scarf over her head and a basket of vegetables in her arms. I waited until she was gone before asking Mark, why did they fight for me? Because the dead hate Strigoi. The Strigoi are unnatural, neither living nor dead, just existing in some state in between. Just as we sense that evil, so do the ghosts. Seems like they could be a good weapon. That face, normally easy and open, frowned. It's dangerous. People like you and me already walk the edge of darkness and insanity. Openly calling upon the dead only brings us closer to falling over that edge and losing our minds. He glanced at his watch and sighed. Look, I have to go, but I'm serious, Rose. Stay here. Stay out of trouble. Fight Strigoi if they come to you, but don't go seeking them blindly. And definitely leave the ghosts alone. It was a lot of advice to get in a grocery store, a lot of advice I wasn't sure I could follow. But I thanked him and sent my regards to Oksana before paying and leaving as well. I was heading back toward Alina's neighborhood when I rounded a corner and nearly walked right into Abe. He was dressed in his usual flashy way, wearing that expensive coat and a yellow gold scarf that matched the gold in his jewelry. His guardians hovered nearby. And he leaned casually against a building's brick wall. So this is why you came to Russia. To go to the market like some peasant. No, I said. Of course not. Just sightseeing then? No. I'm just being helpful. Stop trying to get information out of me. You're not as smart as you think you are. That's not true, he said. Look, I told you already. I came here to tell the Belikovs the news. So go back and tell whoever you're working for that that's that. And I told you before not to lie to me, he said. Again. I saw that odd mix of danger and humor. You have no idea how patient I've been with you. From anyone else, I would have gotten the information I needed that first night. Lucky me. I snapped back. What now? Are you going to take me down an alley and beat me up until I tell you why I'm here? I'm losing interest in this whole scary mob boss routine, you know. And I'm losing patience with you, he said. There went the humor, and as he stood over me, I couldn't help but uneasily note that he was better built than most Moroi. A lot of Moroi avoided fights, but I wouldn't have been surprised if Abe had roughed up as many people as his bodyguards had. And honestly, I don't care why you're here anymore. You just need to leave. Now. Don't threaten me, old man. I'll leave whenever the hell I want. It was funny, I'd just sworn to Mark that I didn't know if I could stay in Baya. But when pressured by Abe, I just wanted to dig my feet in. I don't know what you're trying to keep me from, but I'm not scared of you. That also wasn't entirely true. You should be. He returned pleasantly. I can be a very good friend or a very bad enemy. I can make it worth your while if you leave. We can strike a bargain. There was an almost excited gleam in his eyes as he spoke. I recalled Sydney describing him manipulating others, and I got the feeling this was what he lived for, negotiating. Striking trades to get what he wanted. No, I said. I'll leave when I'm ready. And there's nothing you or whoever you're working for can do about it. Hoping I appeared bold, I turned around. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder, jerking me back, nearly causing me to lose the groceries. I started to lunge forward in attack mode, but his guardians were right there in a flash. I knew I wouldn't get far. Your time is up here, hissed Abe. In Baya. In Russia. Go back to the US. I'll give you what you need: money, first-class tickets, whatever. I stepped out of his reach. Backing carefully away. I don't need your help or your money, God only knows where it comes from. A group of people turned the corner across the street, laughing and talking. And I stepped back further, certain Abe wouldn't start a scene with witnesses present. It made me feel braver, which was probably stupid on my part. And I already told you. I'll go back whenever the hell I want. Abe's eyes lifted to the other pedestrians, and he too retreated back with his guardians. That chilling smile was on his face. And I told you. I can be a very good friend or a very bad enemy. Get out of Baya before you find out which. He turned around and left, much to my relief. I didn't want him to see just how much fear his words had left on my face. I went to bed early that night, suddenly feeling antisocial. I lay there for a while. Flipping through another magazine I couldn't read, and amazingly found myself growing more and more tired. I think the encounters with Mark and Abe had exhausted me. Mark's words about staying had hit too close to home after my earlier conversation with Victoria. Abe's thinly veiled threats had raised all my defenses, putting me on guard against whoever was working with him to make me leave Russia. At what point, I wondered, would he truly lose patience and stop trying to bargain? I drifted off to sleep and the familiar sense of an Adrian dream settled around me. It had been a long time since this had happened. And I'd actually thought he'd listen to me when I'd told him to stay away before. Of course, I always told him that. This had been the longest time span to go by without a visit. And as much as I hated to admit it, I'd kind of missed him. The setting he'd chosen this time was a piece of the Academy's property, a woodsy area near a pond. Everything was green and in bloom. And sunlight shone down on us. I suspected Adrian's creation didn't match what Montana's weather was really like right now, but then, he was in control. He could do whatever he wanted. Little damper, he said, smiling. Long time no see. I thought you were done with me, I said, sitting down on a large, smooth rock. Never done with you, he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets and strolling over to me. Although, to tell the truth, I did intend to stay away this time. But, well, I had to make sure you were still alive. Alive and well. He smiled down at me. The sun glinted off his brown hair, giving it golden chestnut highlights. Good. You seem very well, actually. Your aura's better than I've ever seen it. His eyes drifted from my face down to where my hands lay in my lap. Frowning, he knelt down and picked up my right hand. What's this? Oksana's ring was on it. Despite the ring's lack of ornamentation, the metal gleamed brightly in the light. The dreams were so strange. Even though Adrian and I weren't together, exactly. The ring had followed me in and kept its power enough that he could sense it. A charm. It's infused with spirit. Like me, this was apparently something he'd never considered. His expression grew eager. And it heals, right? It's what's keeping some of the darkness from your aura. Some, I said, uneasy about his fixation on it. I took it off and slipped it into my pocket. It's temporary. I met another spirit user and a shadow-kissed damper. More surprise registered on his face. What? Where? I bit my lip and shook my head. Damn it, Rose. This is big. You know how Lissa and I have been looking for other spirit users. Tell me where they are. No. Maybe later. I don't want you guys coming after me. For all I knew, they were already after me, using Abe as their agent. His green eyes flashed angrily. Look. Pretend for a moment the world doesn't revolve around you, okay? This is about Lissa and me, about understanding this crazy magic inside of us. If you've got people who can help us, we need to know. Maybe later, I repeated stonily. I'm moving on soon, then I'll tell you. Why are you always so difficult? Because you like me that way. At the moment? Not so much. It was the kind of joking comment Adrian usually made, but just then, something about it bothered me. For some reason, I got the tiniest feeling that I suddenly wasn't as endearing to him as usual. Just try being patient, I told him. I'm sure you guys have other stuff to work on. And Lissa seems pretty busy with Avery. The words slipped out before I could help it, and some of the bitterness and envy I'd felt watching them the other night laced my tone. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Ladies and gentlemen. She admits it. You have been spying on Lissa. I knew it. I looked away. I just like to know she's alive too. As if I could go anywhere in the world and not know that. She is. Alive and well. Like you. Mostly well. Adrian frowned. Sometimes I get this strange vibe off of her. She doesn't seem quite right, or her aura will flicker a little. Never lasts long, but I still worry. Something in Adrian's voice softened. Avery worries about her too, so Lissa's in good hands. Avery's pretty amazing. I gave him a scathing look. Amazing? Do you like her or something? I hadn't forgotten Avery's comment about leaving the door unlocked for him. Of course I like her. She's a great person. No, I mean like. Not like. Oh, I see, he said, rolling his eyes. We're dealing with elementary school definitions of like. You're not answering the question. Well, like I said, she's a great person. Smart. Outgoing. Beautiful. Something in the way he said beautiful bugged me. I averted my eyes again, playing with the blue nazar around my neck as I tried to parse my feelings. Adrian figured things out first. Are you jealous, little damper? I looked back up at him. No. If I was going to be jealous over you, I would have gone crazy a long time ago, considering all the girls you mess around with. Avery's not the kind of girl you mess around with. Again, I heard that affection in his voice, that dreaminess. It shouldn't have bothered me. I should have been glad he was interested in another girl. After all, I'd been trying to convince him to leave me alone for a very long time. Part of the conditions of him giving me money for this trip had involved me promising to give him a fair shot at dating when and if I returned to Montana. If he got together with Avery, it would be one less thing for me to worry about. And honestly, if it had been any other girl except Avery, I probably wouldn't have minded. But somehow, the idea of her enchanting him was just too much. Wasn't it bad enough that I was losing Lissa to her? How was it possible that one girl could so easily take my place? She'd stolen my best friend. And now the guy who'd sworn up and down that I was the one he wanted was seriously considering replacing me. You're being a hypocrite, a stern voice inside of me said. Why should you feel so wronged about someone else coming into their lives? You abandoned them. Lissa and Adrian both. They have every right to move on. I stood up angrily. Look. I'm done talking to you tonight. Will you let me out of this dream? I'm not telling you where I am. And I'm not interested in hearing about how wonderful Avery is and how much better than me she is. Avery would never act like a little brat, he said. She wouldn't get so offended that someone actually cares enough to check on her. She wouldn't deny me the chance to learn more about my magic because she was paranoid someone would ruin her crazy attempt to get over her boyfriend's death. Don't talk to me about being a brat. I shot back. You're as selfish and self-centered as usual. It's always about you, even this dream is. You hold me against my will, whether I want it or not, because it amuses you. Fine, he said. Voice cold. I'll end this. And I'll end everything between us. I won't be coming back. Good. I hope you mean it this time. His green eyes were the last thing I saw before I woke up in my own bed. I sat up, gasping. My heart felt like it was breaking, and I almost thought I might cry. Adrian was right, I had been a brat. I'd lashed out at him when it wasn't really deserved. And yet, I hadn't been able to help it. I missed Lissa. I even kind of missed Adrian. And now someone else was taking my place, someone who wouldn't just walk away like I had. I won't be coming back. And for the first time ever, I had a feeling he really wouldn't be. Chapter 13. The next day was Easter. Everyone was up and around, getting ready to go to church. The whole house smelled delicious, filled with the sense of Alina's baking. My stomach rumbled. And I wondered if I could wait until this afternoon for the huge dinner she'd prepared. Even though I wasn't always sure about God, I'd gone to church a lot in my life. Mostly. It was a courtesy to others, a way of being polite and social. Dimitri had gone because he found peace there, and I wondered if going today might offer me some insight on what I should do. I felt a little shabby accompanying the others. They'd dressed up, but I didn't have anything other than jeans and casual shirts. Victoria, noticing my dismay, lent me a lacy white blouse that was a little tight but still looked good. Once I was settled with the family into a pew, I looked around, wondering how Dimitri could have taken solace in the academy's tiny chapel when he'd grown up with this place. It was huge. It could have held 4 chapels. The ceilings were higher and more elaborate, and gold decorations and icons of saints seemed to cover every surface. It was overwhelming, dazzling to the eye. Sweet incense hung heavy in the air. So much so that I could actually see the smoke. There were a lot of people there, human and damper, and I was surprised to even spot some Moroi. Apparently, the Moroi visiting town were pious enough to come to church, despite whatever sordid activities they might be engaging in. And speaking of Moroi, Abe isn't here, I said to Victoria, glancing around. She was on my left, Alina sat on my right. While he hadn't struck me as the religious type, I'd kind of expected him to follow me here. I hoped that maybe his absence meant he'd left Bea. I was still unnerved by our last encounter. Did he leave town? I think he's Muslim, Victoria explained. But last I knew, he's still around. Carolina saw him this morning. Damns May. He hadn't left. What was it he'd said? A good friend or a bad enemy? When I said nothing, Victoria gave me a concerned look. He's never really done anything bad when he's around. He usually has meetings and then disappears. I meant it before when I said I didn't think he'd hurt you, but now you're worrying me. Are you in some kind of trouble? Excellent question. I don't know. He just seems interested in me, that's all. I can't figure out why. Her frown deepened. We won't let anything happen to you, she said fiercely. I smiled, both at her concern and because of her resemblance to Dimitri in that moment. Thanks. There are some people back home who might be looking for me. And I think that Abe is just checking up on me. That was a nice way of describing someone who was either going to drag me back to the US kicking and screaming or just make me vanish for good. Victoria seemed to sense I was softening the truth. Well, I mean it. I won't let him hurt you. The service started, cutting off our conversation. While the priest's chanting was beautiful, it meant even less to me than church services usually did. It was all in Russian, like at the funeral, and no one was going to bother translating it for me today. It didn't matter. Still taking in the beauty of my surroundings, I found my mind wandering. To the left of the altar, a golden-haired angel looked at me from a 4-foot-tall icon. An unexpected memory came to me. Dimitri had once gotten permission for me to accompany him on a quick weekend trip to Idaho to meet with some other guardians. Idaho wasn't any place I was keen on going. But I welcomed the time with him, and he'd convinced school officials that it was a learning experience. That had been shortly after Mason's death. And after the shock wave that tragedy had sent through the school, I think they would have allowed me anything, to be honest. Unfortunately, there was little that was leisurely or romantic about the trip. Dimitri had a job to do, and he had to do it quickly. So we made the best time we could, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Considering our last road trip had involved us stumbling onto a Moroi massacre, this one being uneventful was probably for the best. As usual, he wouldn't let me drive, despite my claims that I could get us there in half the time. Or maybe that was why he wouldn't let me drive. We stopped at one point to get gas and scrounge some food from the station store. We were up in the mountains somewhere, in a tiny town that rivaled St. Vladimir's for remote location. I could see mountains on clear days at school. But it was a totally different experience being in them. They surrounded us and were so close it seemed like you could just jump over and land on one. Dimitri was finishing up with the car. Holding my sub sandwich, I walked around to the back of the gas station to get a better view. Whatever civilization the gas station offered disappeared as soon as I cleared it. Endless snowy pines stretched out before me, and all was still and quiet, save for the distant sound of the highway behind me. My heart ached over what had happened to Mason. And I was still having nightmares about the Strigoi who'd held us captive. That pain was a long way from disappearing, but something about this peaceful setting soothed me for a moment. Looking down at the unbroken, foot-high snow, a crazy thought suddenly came to me. I let myself go, falling back first to the ground. The thick snow embraced me, and I rested there a moment, taking comfort in lying down. Then I moved my legs and arms back and forth, carving out new hollows in the snow. When I finished, I didn't get up right away. I simply continued lounging, staring up at the blue sky. "What," asked Dimitri, "are you doing? Aside from getting your sandwich cold?" His shadow fell over me, and I looked up at his tall form. In spite of the cold, the sun was out, and its rays backlit his hair. He could have been an angel himself, I thought. "I'm making a snow angel," I replied. "Don't you know what that is?" "Yes, I know." "But why?" "You must be freezing." I had on a heavy winter coat, hat, gloves, and all the other requisite cold weather accessories. He was right about the sandwich. Not so much, actually. My face is a little, I guess. He shook his head and gave me a wry smile. "You'll be cold when you're in the car and all that snow starts melting. I think you're more worried about the car than about me." He laughed. "I'm more worried about you getting hypothermia." "In this? This is nothing." I patted the ground beside me. "Come on. You make one too, and then we can go." He continued looking down at me. "So I can freeze too? So you can have fun? So you can leave your mark on Idaho? Besides, it shouldn't bother you at all, right? Don't you have some sort of super cold resistance from Siberia?" He sighed, a smile still on his lips. It was enough to warm me even in this weather. There you go again, convinced Siberia is like Antarctica. I'm from the southern part. The weather's almost the same as here. "You're making excuses," I told him. "Unless you want to drag me back to the car, you're going to have to make an angel too." Dimitri studied me for several heavy moments, and I thought he might actually haul me away. His face was still light and open, though. And his expression was filled with a fondness that made my heart race. Then, without warning, he flopped into the snow beside me, lying there quietly. "Okay," I said when he did nothing more. "Now you have to move your arms and legs. I know how to make a snow angel." "Then do it. Otherwise, you're more like a chalk outline at a police crime scene." He laughed again. And the sound was rich and warm in the still air. Finally, after a little more coaxing on my part, he moved his arms and legs too, making an angel of his own. When he finished, I expected him to jump up and demand we get back on the road, but instead, he stayed there too, watching the sky and the mountains. Pretty, huh? I asked. My breath made frosty clouds in the air. I guess in some ways, it's not that different from the ski resort's view, but I don't know. I feel different about it all today. Life's like that, he said. As we grow and change, sometimes things we've experienced before take on new meaning. It'll happen for the rest of your life. I started to tease him about his tendency to always deliver these profound life lessons. But it occurred to me then that he was right. When I'd first begun falling for Dimitri, the feelings had been all-consuming. I'd never felt anything like it before. I'd been convinced there was no possible way I could love him more. But now, after what I'd witnessed with Mason and the Strigoi, things were different. I did love Dimitri more intensely. I loved him in a different way, in a deeper way. Something about seeing how fragile life was made me appreciate him more. It had made me realize how much he meant to me and how sad I'd be if I ever lost him. You think it'd be nice to have a cabin up there? I asked, pointing to a nearby peak. Out in the woods where no one could find you? I would think it was nice. I think you'd be bored. I tried to imagine being stuck in the wilderness with him. Small room, fireplace, bed. I didn't think it'd be that boring. It wouldn't be so bad if we had cable. And internet. And body heat. Oh, Rose. He didn't laugh, but I could tell he was smiling again. I don't think you'd ever be happy someplace quiet. You always need something to do. Are you saying I have a short attention span? Not at all. I'm saying there's a fire in you that drives everything you do, that makes you need to better the world and those you love. To stand up for those you can't. It's one of the wonderful things about you. Only one, huh? I spoke lightly, but his words had thrilled me. He'd meant what he said about thinking those were wonderful traits, and feeling his pride in me meant more than anything just then. One of many, he said. He sat up and looked down at me. So, no peaceful cabin for you. Not until you're an old woman. What, like 40? He shook his head in exasperation and stood up. Not gracing my joke with a response. Still, he regarded me with the same affection I'd heard in his voice. There was admiration too. And I thought I could never be unhappy as long as Dimitri thought I was wonderful and beautiful. Leaning down, he extended his hand. Time to go. I took it, letting him help pull me up. Once standing, we held hands for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then we let go and surveyed our work. Two perfect snow angels, one much taller than the other. Careful to step inside each outline, I leaned down and hacked out a horizontal line above each head. What's that? He asked, when I stood beside him again. Halos, I said with a grin. For heavenly creatures like us. That might be a stretch. We studied our angels for a few moments more, looking at where we had lain side by side in that sweet, quiet moment. I wished what I'd said was true, that we had truly left our mark on the mountain. But I knew that after the next snowfall, our angels would disappear into the whiteness and be nothing more than a memory. Dimitri touched my arm gently, and without another word, we turned around and headed back to the car. Compared to that memory of him and the way he'd looked at me out there on the mountain, I thought the angel looking back at me in church seemed pale and boring in comparison. No offense to her. The congregation was filing back to their seats after taking bread and wine. I'd stayed seated for that, but I did understand a few of the priest's words. Life. Death. Destroy. Eternal. I knew enough about all this to string together the meaning. I would have bet good money resurrection was in there too. I sighed. wishing it were truly that easy to vanquish death and bring back those we loved. Church ended, and I left with the Belikovs, feeling melancholy. As people passed each other near the entrance, I saw some eggs being exchanged. Victoria had explained that it was a big tradition around here. A few people I didn't know gave some to me. And I felt a little bad that I had nothing to give in return. I also wondered how I was going to eat them all. They were decorated in various ways. Some were simply colored. Others were elaborately designed. Everyone seemed chatty after church, and we all stood around outside it. Friends and family hugged and caught up on gossip. I stood near Victoria, smiling and trying to follow the conversation that often took place in both English and Russian. Victoria. We turned and saw Nikolai striding toward us. He gave us by which I mean. He gave her a brilliant smile. He dressed up for the holiday and looked amazing in a sage shirt and dark green tie. I eyed Victoria, wondering if it had any effect on her. Nope. Her smile was polite, genuinely happy to see him, but there was nothing romantic there. Again, I wondered about her mystery friend. He had a couple of guys with him whom I'd met before. They greeted me too. Like the Belikovs, they seemed to think I was a permanent fixture around here. "Are you still going to Marina's party?" asked Nikolai. I'd nearly forgotten. That was the party he'd invited us to the first day I'd met him. Victoria had accepted then, but to my surprise, she now shook her head. "We can't. We have family plans." That was news to me. There was a possibility something had come up that I didn't know about yet, but I doubted it. I had a feeling she was lying, and being a loyal friend, I said nothing to contradict her. It was hard watching Nikolai's face fall, though. "Really? We're going to miss you." She shrugged. "We'll all see each other at school." He didn't seem pacified by that. "Yeah. But dash." Nikolai's eyes suddenly lifted from her face and focused on something behind us. He frowned. Victoria and I both glanced back, and I felt her mood shift too. 3 guys were strolling toward my group. They were Dampiers as well. I didn't notice anything unusual about them, smirks aside, but other Dampiers and Moroi gathered outside the church took on expressions similar to those of my companions. Troubled. Worried. Uncomfortable. The 3 guys came to a stop by us, pushing their way into our circle. "I thought you might be here, Kolya," said one. He spoke in perfect English. And it took me a moment to realize he was talking to Nikolai. I would never understand Russian nicknames. "I didn't know you were back," replied Nikolai stiffly. Studying the 2 of them, I could see a distinct resemblance. They had the same bronze hair and lean build. Brothers, apparently. Nikolai's brother's gaze fell on me. He brightened. "And you must be the unpromised American girl." It didn't surprise me that he knew who I was. After the memorial, most of the local Dampiers had left telling tales about the American girl who had fought battles against Strigoi but carried neither a promise mark nor a graduation mark. "I'm Rose," I said. I didn't know what was up with these guys, but I certainly wasn't going to show any fear in front of them. The guy seemed to appreciate my confidence and shook my hand. "I'm Dennis." He gestured to his friends. "Artur and Leviticus." "When did you come to town?" asked Nikolai, still not looking happy about this reunion. "Just this morning." Dennis turned to Victoria. "I heard about your brother." "I'm sorry." Victoria's expression was hard, but she nodded politely. "Thank you." "Is it true he fell defending Moroi?" I didn't like the sneer in Dennis's voice. But it was Carolina who voiced my angry thoughts. I hadn't noticed her approaching our group. She didn't look happy to see Dennis at all. He fell fighting Strigoi. He died a hero. Dennis shrugged, unaffected by the angry tone of her voice. Still makes him dead. I'm sure the Moroi will sing his name for years to come. They will, I replied. He saved a whole group of them. And Dampiers too. Dennis's gaze fell back on me, his eyes thoughtful as he studied my face for a few seconds. I heard you were there too. That both of you were sent into an impossible battle. It wasn't impossible. We won. Would Dimitri say that if he were alive? Carolina crossed her arms over her chest. If you're only here to start something, then you should leave. This is a church. It was funny. Upon meeting her, I'd thought she seemed so gentle and kind, just an ordinary young mother working to support her family. But in this moment, she seemed more like Dimitri than ever. I could see that same strength within her, that fierceness that drove her to protect loved ones and stand up to her enemies. Not that these guys were her enemies, exactly. I honestly didn't yet understand who they were. We're just talking, said Dennis. I just want to understand what happened to your brother. Believe me. I think his death was a tragedy. He wouldn't have regretted it, I told them. He died fighting for what he believed in. Defending others who took him for granted. That's not true. Oh. Dennis gave me a lopsided smile. Then why don't you work for the Guardians? You've killed Strigoi but have no promise mark. Not even a graduation mark, I heard. Why aren't you out there throwing yourself in front of Moroi? Dennis, said Nikolai uneasily, please just leave. I'm not talking to you, Kolya. Dennis's eyes were still on me. I'm just trying to figure Rose out. She kills Strigoi but doesn't work for the Guardians. She's clearly not like the rest of you soft people in this town. Maybe she's more like us. She's nothing like you, Victoria snapped back. I got it then, and a chill ran down my spine. These were the kind of Dampiers that Mark had been talking about. The true unpromised ones. The vigilantes who sought out Strigoi on their own, the ones who neither settled down nor answered to any guardians. They shouldn't have unnerved me, not really. In some ways, Dennis was right. In the simplest terms, I really was like them. And yet, there was an air about these guys that just rubbed me the wrong way. Then why are you in Russia? Asked one of Dennis's friends. I already couldn't remember his name. This is a long trip for you. You wouldn't have come here without a good reason. Victoria was picking up her sister's anger. She came to tell us about Dimka. Dennis eyed me. I think she's here to hunt Strigoi. There are more in Russia to choose from than there are in the States. She wouldn't be in Baya if she was hunting Strigoi, you idiot. Returned Victoria evenly. She'd be in Vladivostok or Novosibirsk or somewhere like that. Novosibirsk. The name was familiar. But where had I heard it? A moment later, the answer came to me. Sydney had mentioned it. Novosibirsk was the largest city in Siberia. Dennis continued. Maybe she's just passing through. Maybe she'll want to join us when we go to Novosibirsk tomorrow. For God's sake, I exclaimed. I'm right here. Stop talking about me like I'm not. And why would I want to go with you? Dennis's eyes gleamed with an intense, feverish light. Good hunting there. Lots of Strigoi. Come with us, and you can help us go after them. And how many of you will come back from this? Carolina asked in a hard voice. Where's Timosha? Where's Vasily? Your hunting party keeps getting smaller each time you return here. Which one of you will be next? Whose family will be the next to mourn? Easy for you to talk, retorted the friend. Lev. I think his name was. You stay here and do nothing while we go out and keep you safe. Carolina gave him a disgusted look, and I recalled how she was dating a guardian. You go out and rush into situations without thinking. If you want to keep us safe, then stay here and defend your families when they need it. If you want to go after Strigoi, go join the Guardians and work with those who have some sense. The Guardians don't hunt Strigoi, cried Dennis. They sit and wait and cower before the Moroi. The unfortunate part was, he had a point. But not entirely. That's changing, I said. There's a movement to start taking the offensive against the Strigoi. There's also talk of the Moroi learning to fight with us. You could help be a part of that. Like you are, he laughed. You still haven't told us why you're here and not with them. You can say what you want to the rest of this group. But I know why you're here. I can see it in you. The crazy, eerie look he gave me almost made me think that he could. You know, the only way to rid the world of evil is to do it on our own. To seek out the Strigoi ourselves and kill them, one by one. Without a plan, finished Carolina. Without any thought of the consequences. We're strong and we know how to fight. That's all we need to know when it comes to killing Strigoi. And that was when I understood. I finally got what Mark had been trying to tell me. Dennis was saying exactly what I had been thinking since I left St. Vladimir's. I'd run off without a plan. Wanting to throw myself into danger because I felt I had a mission that only I could carry out. Only I could kill Dimitri. Only I could destroy the evil within him. I'd been giving no thought to how I'd pull it off, seeing as Dimitri had beat me more often than not in fights when he was still a damper. With a Strigoi's strength and speed now, the odds were definitely against me. Still, I hadn't cared. I'd been obsessed, convinced I had to do this. In my own head, what I had to do made sense, but now, hearing those sentiments from Dennis, it sounded crazy. Just as reckless as Mark had warned. Their motives might be good just as mine were, but they were also suicidal. Without Dimitri, I honestly hadn't cared much about my own life. I'd never been afraid to risk it before, but now I realized there was a big difference between dying uselessly and dying for a reason. If I died trying to kill Dimitri because I had no strategy, then my life would have meant nothing. Just then, the priest walked over and said something to us in Russian. From his tone and expression, I think he was asking if everything was okay. He'd mingled with the rest of the congregation after the service. Being human, he probably didn't know all the damper politics afoot, but he could undoubtedly sense trouble. Dennis offered him a simpering smile and gave what sounded like a polite explanation. The priest smiled in return, nodded, and wandered off when someone else called to him. Enough, said Carolina harshly, once the priest was out of earshot. You need to go. Now. Dennis's body tensed, and mine responded, ready for a fight. I thought he might start something then and there. A few seconds later, he relaxed and turned to me. Show them to me first. Show you what? I asked. The marks. Show me how many Strigoi you've killed. I didn't respond right away, wondering if this was a trick. Everyone's eyes were on me. Turning slightly, I lifted the hair off the back of my neck and showed my tattoos. Little lightning-shaped Molnija marks were there, along with the mark I'd gotten for the battle. From the sound of Dennis's gasp, I was guessing he'd never seen that many kills before. I let my hair go and met his gaze levelly. Anything else? I asked. You're wasting your time, he said at last, gesturing to the people behind me. With them. With this place. You should come with us to Novosibirsk. We'll help make your life worthwhile. I'm the only one who can make anything of my life. I pointed down the street. You were asked to leave. Now go. I held my breath, still bracing for a fight. After several tense moments, the group retreated. Before turning around, Dennis gave me one last piercing look. This isn't what you want and you know it. When you change your mind, come find us at 83 Kosakova. We leave at sunrise tomorrow. You'll be leaving without me, I said. Dennis' smile sent another chill down my spine. We'll see. Chapter 14. The encounter with Dennis left me even more confused than before. It was a shocking illustration of Mark's warning, an omen of what I too might become if I wasn't careful. I wasn't really the same as Dennis, was I? I wasn't aimlessly seeking danger. I was seeking danger, well, for a reason. I had to fulfill the promise I'd made to find Dimitri. Maybe it was suicidal and I was only deluding myself into thinking it was noble. Victoria left me little opportunity to ruminate. Later that evening, as the family was settling down in the living room after way too much food, she glibly asked Alina, "Can I go over to Marina's? She's having a party before we go back to school." Wow. It looked like Abe and the alchemists weren't the only ones keeping secrets around here. I glanced between Alina and Victoria's faces, curious as to how this would play out. Alina and Yeva were both knitting, but Yeva didn't look up. Victoria had spoken in English. Alina's face turned thoughtful. "You have to leave early tomorrow to go back to school." "I know. But I can sleep on the bus. Everyone else will be there tonight." "Everyone else isn't a convincing argument," scoffed Alina. "They'll all be tired tomorrow too," replied Victoria, grinning. "You'll miss your last night with Rose." "I'll hang out with her after I get back." "Great. And stay up even later." "Not that late. I'll be back by 2. "Absolutely not. You'll be back by midnight." Alina returned to her knitting. But that had been permission if I'd ever heard it. Victoria looked at the clock. It was almost 8:30. Her face told me she wasn't happy about the curfew, but she apparently decided to take what she could get. Carolina gave us an odd look as we left the room but remained silent. Sonia and Paul, engrossed in TV, barely noticed our departure. I had to find out what was going on. "Okay," I said once we were heading upstairs, "what gives? I thought you weren't going to Marina's." Victoria grinned and beckoned me into her bedroom. I'd recently learned her bedroom used to be Dimitri's, and every time I was in here, I had to resist the urge to go bury myself in the bed. Even though I knew the sheets had been washed countless times since those days. Somehow, I could imagine them smelling like Dimitri and feeling warm as though we were both lying there together. "I'm not." Victoria began rifling through her closet and pulled out a short, sleeveless red dress with lace around the straps. The fabric was stretchy, the kind that looked like it'd show everything. I was shocked when she began putting it on. It was pretty trashy. "Is this a joke?" "Nope." Victoria took off her shirt and jeans and pulled the dress on. She had no trouble with it, but it was every bit as clingy as it had appeared. She wasn't as filled out as I was on top. But in a dress like that, it didn't matter. "Okay," I said, catching on at last. "What's his name?" "Roland," she said. "Oh, Rose. He's amazing. And this is the last night I'll get to see him before school." I didn't know whether to feel happy for her or sad for Nikolai. This Roland guy must have been the reason she couldn't give Nikolai the time of day. She was totally in love with someone else. Still, that dress. "You must really like him," I observed dryly. Her eyes widened. "Do you want to meet him?" Well, I don't want to interfere with your date." "You won't. Just stop by and say hi, okay?" It felt pretty intrusive. Yet at the same time, well, I was kind of curious about a guy who could get her to leave the house in that kind of outfit, particularly when she started applying really heavy makeup. Extra dark eyeliner and bright red lipstick. So I agreed to meet Roland, and we left the house as quietly as we could. Despite wearing a coat over her dress. Victoria still didn't want to run into her mother. We headed downtown, following a few twists and turns until we ended up behind what looked like an ordinary warehouse in an abandoned part of town. All was quiet, but a tall, tough-looking damper stood by a door leading into the building, his arms crossed in front of him. Victoria brought us to a halt nearby, saying we had to wait there. A minute later, a group of Moroi men of mixed ages wandered up, chatting and laughing. The damper gave them a once-over and then opened the door for them. Light and music spilled out until the door shut and all went silent again. "So this is Bea's secret damper world," I murmured. She didn't hear me because suddenly, her face lit up. "There he is." She pointed to two approaching guys. Both were Moroi. Well, who knew? Victoria's secret boyfriend wasn't a damper. I guess that wasn't too shocking, really. Though the way she dressed tonight still bothered me. She gave him a fierce hug and introduced us. His friend was named Sergey. And he smiled politely before hurrying inside where he was apparently meeting a girl too. I had to give Victoria credit, Roland was hot. His hair was dark auburn, soft and wavy. The green of his eyes reminded me painfully of Adrian's. And when he smiled at Victoria, it was dazzling. The look on her face was exactly like Nikolai's whenever he was around her. Roland took a hold of Victoria's hands and brought them to his lips, kissing each one. Those green eyes gazed at hers, and he murmured something I couldn't hear. She blushed and replied in Russian. I didn't need any translation to know the content was sexy and flirty. Still smiling, he glanced over at me, and although she'd introduced us, it was like he was noticing me for the first time and was interested. You're new here, aren't you? He asked. Victoria wrapped her arms around him and rested her head on his chest. Rose is visiting. She's a friend of the family. Ah, he said. Now I remember hearing about you. I had no idea such a fierce Strigoi killer would be so beautiful. It's part of the job description, I said dryly. Will you be returning to school with Victoria? He asked. No. I'll be staying here a little longer. I still had no clue, though. If a little longer was 1 hour or 1 year. He said thoughtfully. He looked back down at Victoria and pressed a kiss to her hair, running his fingers along her throat. His next words were to her. I'm glad you were able to come here before you left. I don't know how I'll get by with you so far away. She beamed. There was no way I could leave without seeing you one more time, she trailed off, too overcome with emotion, and as he leaned down, hands still on her throat. I thought for an awful moment that they were going to start making out then and there. Fortunately, the appearance of an approaching damper girl interrupted them. Victoria broke from Roland and embraced the other girl. They apparently hadn't seen each other in a while and chatted rapidly in Russian, ignoring Roland and me. Free of her for a moment. He leaned toward me. Once Victoria has returned to school, you'll be all alone here. Maybe I could show you around then. Thanks, but I've already seen everything. He kept that big smile on. Of course. Well, then, perhaps we could simply get together and talk? I couldn't believe it. This guy had had his hands all over Victoria 30 seconds ago and was now trying to score plans with me the instant she left town. I was disgusted and had to restrain myself from doing something stupid. Sorry, but I don't think I'll be around long enough. I got the impression that women didn't refuse him very often. He frowned and started to protest, but Victoria returned and wrapped herself around him again. He studied me for several more puzzled seconds and then shifted his attention to her. Smiling and turning on the charm. She ate it all up, and while the two tried to include me in their conversation, it was clear they were totally absorbed in each other. Roland might be interested in me, but for now, she was an easier target and one that wouldn't be available much longer. I felt that disgust roil up in me again. The longer we stood out there, the more I realized what was going on. All the people going inside were Moroi guys or damper girls. And the girls were all dressed like Victoria. This was a blood whore den. Suddenly, Bea's secret damper world held no appeal. I hated it. I wanted nothing more than to get out of here. No, wait. I wanted nothing more than to get out of here and drag Victoria away. Even kicking and screaming. Roland was sleazy, no question, and I didn't want her anywhere near him. Yet it soon became clear they weren't going to stand out in the alley all night. They wanted to go inside and do God only knew what. Victoria, I said, trying to be reasonable, are you sure you don't want to come back home and hang out? I mean, I won't get to see you tomorrow. She hesitated, then shook her head. I won't get to see Roland either. But I promise I'll come see you as soon as I get home later. We'll stay up all night. Mom won't care. I didn't know what other protests to make. Roland's impatience, now that I'd refused him, was starting to show. He wanted to go inside. I wondered what was there, a dance floor? Bedrooms? I probably could have gone with them to see for myself, despite being underdressed or, well, overdressed as far as amounts of clothing went. Yet I couldn't bring myself to do it. All my life, I'd been taught about blood whores and why their lifestyle was wrong. I didn't know if Victoria was becoming one, and I hoped she wasn't, but there was no way I could set foot in there. It was a matter of principle. I watched them go with a heavy heart, wondering what I'd just let my friend walk into. Seeing her in that ultra-tight dress, plastered all over him, suddenly made me reevaluate everything. How much of this peaceful life in Bea was a sham? Was Victoria, the girl who'd called me a sister, really not the person I thought she was? Confused, I turned away to head back home and almost walked into Abe. Again. What the hell? I exclaimed. He wore a tuxedo tonight, complete with tails and a silvery silk scarf. Are you stalking me? Stupid question. Of course he was. I hoped his formal wear meant he wouldn't be dragging me off this evening. His guardians were equally well dressed. Idly, I wondered if a place like this had something to do with his illegal business dealings. Was he trafficking blood whores? Like some kind of pimp? Unlikely. Seeing as most of these girls didn't require much urging. Abe gave me that annoying knowing smile of his. I see your friend is off to an interesting night. I had no idea Victoria had such lovely legs. Now everyone knows, thanks to that dress. I clenched my fists and leaned toward him. Don't you dare talk about her like that, old man. I'm not saying anything that isn't obvious to everybody else. It'll certainly be obvious to young Roland soon. You don't know anything about them. Yet I didn't believe my own words. Not after seeing them walk off together. Abe, I could tell, knew what I was thinking. These girls all say it won't happen to them. But it always does. It's what'll happen to you if you stay. Oh. Here we are, I said mockingly. I knew a threat had to be coming. The part where you order me again to leave the country or else bad things will happen. He gestured toward the door. Where more Moroi and Dampiers were going. I don't even need to make anything bad happen. You'll do it on your own by staying here. You'll waste your life away, running errands for Alina Belikova. Potlucks will become the most exciting thing in your world. They're good people, I growled. Don't mock them. Oh, I'm not denying that. He straightened his silk scarf. They are good people. But they aren't your people. This is a fantasy. You're deluding yourself. He was all sternness now. Your grief has sent you here. Your man was ripped away from you. And you've ripped yourself away from your old friends. You're trying to make up for it by convincing yourself that this is your family, that this is your home. They're not. This isn't. I could make this my home. I still wasn't sure of that, but my stubborn nature made me want to contradict him. You aren't meant for Bea, he said, dark eyes blazing. You're meant for better things. You need to go back home, back to your school and the Dragomir princess. How the hell do you know about her? Who are you? When are you going to tell me who you work for? What do you want with me? I had a feeling I was on the verge of hysterics. Hearing him refer to Lissa snapped something inside of me. I'm merely an observer who can tell you're wasting your time here. This is no life for you, Rose. Your life is back in the States. They say you were on track to be a great guardian. Do you know what an honor it is to be assigned to the last Dragomir? You could spend your life in elite, powerful circles. The reputation you've already gained will raise you in status and regard. You have a stunning career ahead of you, and it's not too late to go back to it. Not yet. Who are you to talk about how I should live my life? I've heard that your hands are bloody. You're not exactly a good role model. What is it you're involved in, anyway? My own affairs. And it's exactly because of the life I lead that you should listen to me when I say abandon this path and go back home. His words were urgent and authoritative. And I couldn't believe he had the audacity to talk to me like that. That's not my life anymore, I said icily. He gave a harsh laugh and gestured around us once more. What, and this is? You want to go off and be a blood whore like your friend in there? Don't call her that. I shouted. I don't care if you've got bodyguards or not. I will hurt you, old man. If you say anything else about Victoria. He didn't flinch at my explosion. That was harsh, I admit. She's not a blood whore. Not yet. But she's one step away from it. As I said. It always happens in the end. Even if you aren't used by someone like Roland Kislyak, and believe me, he will use her. Just like he did her sister, you'll still end up alone with a baby you're way too young for. Wait. I froze. Are you saying he's the guy who got Sonia pregnant? Why would Victoria be involved with him after he did that and left her sister? Because she doesn't know. Sonia doesn't talk about it, and Mr. Kislyak thinks it's a game. Getting two sisters into bed. Too bad for him that Carolina's smarter than the others, or he could have had them all. Who knows? He gave me a sardonic smile. Maybe he'll consider you part of the family enough to go after you next. Like hell. I'd never get involved with anyone like that. I'm never going to be involved with anyone again. Not after Dimitri. Abe's sternness gave way to momentary amusement. Oh, Rose. You are young. You've barely lived. Everyone thinks their first love is the only one they'll ever have. This guy was really pissing me off. But I gained enough control to decide I wasn't going to punch him. At least, I didn't think so. I backed up a little, toward the building. I'm not going to play your game here. And you can tell whoever you're working for that I'm not playing theirs either, and that I'm not going back. One way or another, whether it was to hunt Dimitri or live with his family. I was staying in Russia. You're going to have to box me up and ship me there. Not that I wanted to give Abe any ideas. I suspected he could do it if he wanted. Damn it. Who was behind this? Who would want to find me badly enough to send this guy after me? Weirder still, whoever it was someone who cared enough about me to attempt reason. If Abe had actually wanted to abduct me, he already would have. He could have done it the night he brought me to Bea. All he would have had to do was keep driving to the nearest airport. I eventually needed to figure this out. But first I needed to get away from Abe. I backed up further. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me. And don't spy on me anymore. This ends now. Abe studied me for several seconds. His dark eyes narrowed thoughtfully. I could practically see the wheels of plots and world domination spinning in his head. At last he said, so quietly I could hardly hear him. It won't end with them, though. Who? He pointed at the door. Victoria and Roland. What are you getting at? You know what I'm getting at. She thinks she's in love with him. He knows she'll be back in school tomorrow. Tonight's his last chance with her, and he won't waste it. There are lots of bedrooms in there. They're probably in one right now. I tried to control my breathing. Then I'll go tell her mother. It'll be too late. She'd never find them in time, and tomorrow Victoria will be on her way to school and he'll have no interest anymore. What can her mother do after the fact? Ground her? I was getting angry, largely because I had a feeling he was right. Fine. Then I'll drag her off myself. That'll never happen. She wants to do this. She won't leave with you. Even if she did, she'd just find him again. I eyed him. Enough. You're obviously hinting at something, so just get on with it. He smiled, apparently pleased at my astuteness or maybe my bluntness. If you want to save her, you've got to go through him. Through Roland. I scoffed. Not likely. The only way he'd leave her alone is if I offered to take her place. And hey, friendship only went so far. Not if I talked to him. What are you going to do, give him a talk on morality and sway him with reason? Oh, I'll sway him, all right. But believe me, I won't do it with reason well. At least not the kind you're thinking of. If I tell him to leave her alone, he'll leave her alone. For good. I stepped backward without realizing it and hit the wall. Abe looked scary as hell. Smay. I didn't doubt his words at all. He could get Roland to leave Victoria alone. In fact, he probably wouldn't even use his dampiers. Abe could deliver enough terror and probably a good punch to make it happen. Why would you do that for me? I asked. As a sign of good faith. Promise to leave Bea, and I'll deal with him. His eyes gleamed. Both of us could feel the net closing around me. That's your tactic now? You're offering me a trade? My leaving isn't really worth you scaring some Moroi asshole. The net grew tighter. Isn't it, Rose? Frantically, I thought about what to do. Some part of me thought Victoria was free to make her own choices. To love whom she wanted, but I knew for a fact that Roland didn't love her. She was a conquest for him, as shown by his willingness to go after me and Sonia, apparently. What would happen to Victoria? Would she become like the rest of the women here? Would she be the next Balaikov to have a baby? Even if she had no intentions of becoming a guardian, this wasn't the right path for her. Carolina had declined to join the Guardians and now lived a respectable life with her kids and a job that if not exciting was steady and allowed her to keep her dignity. I couldn't let Victoria turn down a road that could ruin the rest of her life. I couldn't let that happen to Dimitri's sister. Dimitri. I knew him. I knew his protective nature. He would never let anything happen to those he cared about. I hated the thought of that blood horden, but I still would have run in to get her because that was what Dimitri would have done. But I didn't know if I'd find her there in time. I knew, however, that Abe could and that he could keep Roland away forever. And so, I spoke without fully understanding the consequences of my words. I'll leave Bea. Chapter 15. Abe glanced over at one of his guardians and gave a swift nod. The man instantly walked away. It's done, Abe said. Just like that? I asked in disbelief. His lips quirked into a smile. Roland knows who I am. He knows who works for me. Once Pavel makes my wishes known, that will be the end of it. I shivered, knowing Abe spoke the truth. Considering what a smartass I'd been to Abe this whole time, it really was a wonder I hadn't had my feet set in cement and been tossed into the ocean. So why aren't you forcefully dragging me out of here? I never like to make anyone do anything they don't want to. Even Roland. It's much easier if people simply see reason and do what I ask them to, without the use of force. And by see reason, you mean blackmail, I said, thinking of what I'd just agreed to. We made a trade, he said. That's all. Don't forget your end of the bargain. You promised to leave here, and you don't seem like the type to go back on your word. I don't. Rose. Victoria suddenly appeared at the door. Wow, that was fast. Pavel was calmly dragging her by her arm. Her hair was mussed, and a dress strap was slipping from her shoulder. Her face was a mixture of incredulity and anger. What did you do? That guy came and told Roland to get out of here and never see me again. And then? Roland agreed. He just left. I found it slightly funny that Victoria immediately blamed me for this. True, I was responsible, but Abe was standing right there. It wasn't a secret who his employees were. Nonetheless, I defended my actions. He was using you, I said. There were tears in Victoria's brown eyes. He loves me. If he loves you, then why did he hit on me as soon as your back was turned? He did not. He's the one who got Sonia pregnant. Even in the alley's dim lighting, I saw her face pale. That's a lie. I threw up my hands. Why would I make that up? He wanted to make plans with me as soon as you were out of town. If he did, she said, voice shaking, it was because you led him on. I gaped. Beside me, Abe listened quietly. A smug look on his face. He was so self-satisfied and probably thought he was being proven right. I wanted to punch him, but Victoria was my concern. How can you think that? I'm your friend. I told her. If you were my friend, you wouldn't be acting like this. You wouldn't try to stand in my way. You act like you loved my brother. But there's no way you could have no way you really understand love. Didn't understand love? Was she crazy? If she only knew what I'd sacrificed for Dimitri. What I'd done to be where I was now, all for love. She was the one who couldn't understand. Love wasn't a fling in a back room at a party. It was something you lived and died for. My emotions surged. That darkness welling up within me that made me want to lash out in return for her horrible accusation. It was only through the strongest of efforts that I remembered she was already hurting. That she only said the things she did because she was confused and upset. Victoria, I do understand, and I'm sorry. I'm only doing this because you're my friend. I care about you. You aren't my friend, she hissed. You aren't part of this family. You don't understand anything about us or how we live. I wish you'd never come here. She turned and stormed away, pushing back inside through the long line of partygoers. My heart ached as I watched her. I turned to Abe. She's going to go try to find him. He still wore that damnably knowing expression. It won't matter. He'll have nothing to do with her anymore. Not if he values that pretty face of his. I was worried for Victoria but kind of had a feeling Abe was right about Roland. Roland would no longer be an issue. As for Victoria's next guy, well, that was a worry for another day. Fine. Then we're done here. Do not follow me anymore, I growled. Keep your promise to leave Bea, and I won't have to. I narrowed my eyes. I told you, I always keep my promises. And as I hurried back to the Belikov house, I suddenly wondered if that was true. The blowout with Abe and Victoria was like cold water on my face. What was I doing here? To a certain extent, Abe had been right. I had been deluding myself. Pretending Dimitri's family was my own in order to soothe my grief over him. But they weren't. This wasn't home. The academy wasn't my home either, not anymore. The only thing I had left was my promise to Dimitri. The promise I'd somehow lost sight of since coming here. Some of the Belaikov family was in bed when I got home. But others were still in the living room. I slipped upstairs to my room, waiting anxiously for Victoria to get home. A half-hour later, I heard footsteps on the stairs and the sound of her door closing. I knocked gently on it. "Victoria," I said in a loud whisper. "It's me. Please talk to me." "No," came the response. "I don't ever want to talk to you again. Victoria dash. Go away. I'm just worried about you. You aren't my brother. You aren't even my sister. You have no place here. Ouch." Her voice was muffled by the door, but I didn't want to risk a fight in the hall and let the others hear. Going to my room, my heart breaking, I stopped and stood in front of the mirror. It was then that I knew she was right. Even Abe was right. Bea wasn't my place. In a flash, my meager belongings were packed, but I hesitated before going downstairs. Victoria's closed door stared at me, and I had to fight the urge to knock again. If I did, it would only trigger another fight. Or, maybe even worse. She would forgive me and then I would want to stay forever, lost in the comfort of Dimitri's family and their simple life. Taking a deep breath, I headed downstairs and walked out the front door. I wanted to tell the others goodbye but worried the same thing would happen, that I'd look at their faces and change my mind. I needed to go, I realized. I was angry at both Victoria and Abe. Their words had hurt me, but there'd been truth in them. This wasn't my world. I had other things to do with my life. And I had a lot of promises to keep. When I was about 8 blocks away, I slowed down, not because I was tired but because I wasn't sure where I was going. Leaving that house had been the biggest step. I sank down on the curb in front of a neighbor's silent, dark yard. I wanted to cry without knowing why. I wanted my old life back. I wanted Dimitri and Lisa. Oh, God, I wanted them. But Dimitri was gone. And the only way I'd see him was if I truly set out to kill him. And as for Lisa, she was more or less gone to me too. Even if I survived this, I didn't think she could forgive me. Sitting there, feeling lost and alone, I tried reaching out to her one more time. I knew it was foolish, considering what I'd seen before, but I had to try one more time. I had to know if I really could have my old place back there. I slipped inside her mind instantly, my runaway emotions making the transition easy. She was on a private jet. If Jill had been stunned by meeting St. Vladimir's A-list students, going on a trip with them made her downright comatose. She stared at everything wide-eyed and barely said a word during the whole flight to the royal court. When Avery offered her a glass of champagne, Jill could barely stammer out, "And no thanks." After that, the others seemed to forget about her and got carried away by their own conversation. Lisa noticed Jill's uneasiness but didn't do much to remedy it. That was a shock. The Lisa I had known would have gone out of her way to make Jill comfortable and be included. Fortunately, the younger girl seemed perfectly entertained by watching the others' antics. I also took comfort in knowing Jill would be okay once she met up with Mia. Lisa had sent word ahead to Mia to come pick up Jill when they landed. Seeing as Lisa and the others had to attend to one of Tatiana's functions right away, Mia had said she'd take Jill under her wing for the weekend and show her some of the innovative things she'd learned to do with her water magic. Lisa was glad for this. Happy she wouldn't be babysitting a freshman all weekend. Even if Jill was totally off of Lisa's radar, one person wasn't, Avery's brother Reed. Their father had decided it would be a good idea for Reed to go with them, and seeing as Headmaster Lazar had played a key role in working with Tatiana to arrange this trip, There was little argument. Avery had rolled her eyes and spoken to Lissa about it covertly, just before boarding. "We're all riding your reputation," Avery said. "Part of the reason Dad let me come was because you're in good with the Queen, and he wants it to rub off on me. He's then hoping I'll get in good with her. And then that'll rub off on Reed and the rest of the family." Lissa tried not to overthink the logic too much. Mostly. She was bothered because Reed Lazar was still as unpleasant as he'd been the first day they met. He wasn't really mean or anything, it just made her uncomfortable being around him. Really. He was the polar opposite of Avery. Whereas she was animated and could always strike up conversation, he stayed tight-lipped and spoke only when spoken to. Lissa couldn't really tell if it was shyness or disdain. When Lissa had tried asking him if he was excited to go to court, Reed had simply shrugged. "Whatever. I don't care." His tone had been almost hostile, like he resented her for asking, so she'd given up all other attempts at conversation. The only person, other than his sister, that Lissa saw Reed ever speak to was Avery's guardian Simon. He had also come along. When the flight landed, Mia was as good as her word. She waved enthusiastically when Lissa stepped off the plane, her blonde curls whipping around in the wind. Lissa grinned back, and they gave each other quick half-hugs, something that never failed to amuse me given their former enemy status. Lissa made introductions for those who needed them as an escort of guardians led them away from the landing strip and toward the inner portion of court. Mia welcomed Jill so warmly that the younger girl's uneasiness faded, and excitement glowed in her green eyes. Smiling fondly, Mia glanced away from Jill and over to Lissa. "Where's Rose?" Silence fell, followed by uncomfortable glances. "What?" demanded Mia. "What did I say?" "Rose is gone," said Lissa. "Sorry. I thought you knew. She dropped out and left after the attack because there were some things, some personal things, she needed to take care of." Lissa feared Mia would ask about the personal things. Only a few people knew about my search for Dimitri, and Lissa wanted to keep it that way. Most thought I just disappeared from post-battle trauma. Mia's next question completely shocked Lissa. "Why didn't you go with her?" "What?" Lissa stammered. "Why would I do that?" Rose dropped out. "No way am I going to." "Yeah, I suppose." Mia turned speculative. "You guys are just so close even without the bond. I assumed you'd follow each other to the ends of the earth and figure out the details later." Mia's own life had gone through so much upheaval that she took that kind of thing in stride. That weird, fluctuating anger I'd been feeling pop up in Lissa every so often suddenly reared its head and turned on Mia. "Yeah, well, if we were so close. Then it seems like she wouldn't have left in the first place. She's the selfish one, not me." The word stung me and clearly shocked Mia. Mia had a temper of her own. But she sat on it and simply held up her hands in an apologetic way. She really had changed. "Sorry. Wasn't trying to accuse you of anything." Lissa said nothing else. Since my departure, she'd beat herself up about a lot of things. She'd gone over and over things she could have done for me before or after the attack, things that might have made me stay. But it had never occurred to her to go with me, and the revelation hit her like a smack to the face. Mia's words made her feel guilty and angry all at the same time, and she wasn't sure who she was the maddest at, me or herself. "I know what you're thinking," said Adrian a few minutes later. Once Mia had led Jill away and promised to meet up later. "What, you read minds now?" asked Lissa. "Don't have to. It's written all over your face. And Rose never would have let you go with her. So stop agonizing over it." They entered the royal guest housing, which was just as lush and opulent as it had been when I'd stayed there. "You don't know that." I could have talked her into it. "No," said Adrian sharply. "You couldn't have. I'm serious, don't give yourself one more thing to be depressed about. Hey, who said I'm depressed? Like I said, she abandoned me. Adrian was surprised. Since my departure, Lissa had been more sad than anything. She'd occasionally been angry at my decision, but neither Adrian nor I had seen such vehemence from her. Dark feelings boiled within her heart. I thought you understood, said Adrian with a small, puzzled frown. I thought you said you'd dash. Avery suddenly interrupted, giving Adrian a sharp look. Hey! Hey! Leave her alone, okay? We'll see you at the reception. They were at a point where the groups had to split, girls going to one part of the lodging and guys to the other. Adrian looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he nodded and headed off with Reed and a couple of guardians. Avery put a gentle arm around Lissa as she glared at Adrian's retreating figure. You okay? Avery's normally laughing face was filled with concern. It startled Lissa in the same way Adrian's moments of seriousness always startled me. I guess. I don't know. Don't beat yourself up over what you could have or should have done. The past is gone. Move on to the future. Lissa's heart was still heavy, her mood blacker than it had been in quite a while. She managed a tight smile. I think that's the wisest thing you've ever said. I know. Can you believe it? Do you think it'll impress Adrian? They dissolved into laughter. Yet despite her cheery exterior, Lissa was still struck by Mia's offhand comments. They plagued Lissa in a way she hadn't thought possible. What really bothered her the most wasn't the thought that if she'd come with me, she could have kept me out of trouble. No. Her biggest issue was that she hadn't thought of coming with me in the first place. I was her best friend. As far as she was concerned, that should have been her immediate reaction to my departure. It hadn't been, and now Lissa was racked with even more guilt than usual. The guilt was all-consuming, and she would occasionally transform it to anger to ease the pain. It didn't help much. Her mood didn't improve as the evening progressed, either. Not long after the group's arrival, the Queen hosted a small reception for the most elite of all visitors who had come to the court. Lissa was quickly discovering that the Queen always seemed to be hosting some party or another. At one point in her life, Lissa would have considered that fun. She no longer did. At least not when it came to these kinds of parties. But keeping her dark feelings locked up, Lissa stayed good at playing the role of nice royal girl. The Queen seemed happy that Lissa had a suitable royal friend and was equally pleased when Lissa impressed other royals and dignitaries she was introduced to. At one point, though, Lissa's resolve nearly faltered. Before you leave, said Tatiana, we should see about your guardians. She and Lissa stood together with a group of admirers and hangers-on who were keeping respectful distances. Lissa had been staring vacantly at the bubbles in her untouched champagne and looked up with a start. Guardians, Your Majesty? Well, there's no delicate way to put this, but now. For better or for worse, you're without any protection. The Queen paused respectfully. Belikov was a good man. My name naturally didn't come to her lips. I might as well have never existed. She'd never liked me, particularly since she thought I was going to run off with Adrian. As it was, Lissa had noticed Tatiana watching with some consideration while Avery and Adrian flirted. It was hard to say if the Queen disapproved. Her partying aside, Avery seemed a model girl save that Tatiana had wanted Lissa and Adrian to eventually get together. I don't need any protection right now, said Lissa politely, her heart clenching. No, but you'll be out of school soon enough. We think we've found some excellent candidates for you. One of them's a woman, a lucky find. Janine Hathaway offered to be my guardian, said Lissa suddenly. I hadn't known that, but as she spoke, I read the story in her mind. My mom had approached her not long after I left. I was a little shocked. My mom was very loyal to her current assignment. This would have been a big move for her. Janine Hathaway? Tatiana's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. I'm sure she has other commitments. No, we've got much better choices. This young lady's only a few years older than you. A better choice than Janine Hathaway? Not likely. Before Dimitri, my mother had been the gold standard by which I measured all badassness. Tatiana's young lady was undoubtedly someone under the Queen's control and, more importantly, not a Hathaway. The Queen didn't like my mom any more than she liked me. Once, when Tatiana had been bitching me out for something, she'd made a reference to a man my mother had been involved with, someone whom I suspected might be my father, a guy named Ibrahim. The funny thing was, the Queen had almost sounded like she had once had an interest in the guy too, and I had to wonder if that was part of her dislike for my family. Lissa put on a tight, polite smile for the Queen and thanked her for the consideration. Lissa and I both understood what was going on. This was Tatiana's game. Everyone was part of her plan. And there was no way to go against her. For a brief moment, Lissa had that strange thought again, of something Viktor Dashkov had once said to her. Aside from his crazy killing and kidnapping schemes, Viktor had also wanted to start a revolution among the Moroi. He thought the power distribution was off, something Lissa occasionally believed too, and that it was wielded unfairly by those with too much control. The moment was gone almost as soon as it came. Viktor Dashkov was a crazy villain whose ideas deserved no acknowledgement. Then, as soon as courtesy allowed, Lissa excused herself from the Queen and headed across the room, feeling like she was going to explode with grief and anger. She nearly ran into Avery as she did. God, said Avery. Do you think Reed could embarrass me any more? 2 people have tried to make conversation with him, and he keeps scaring them off. He actually just told Robin Batica to shut up. I mean, yeah, she was going on, but still. That is not cool. Avery's dramatic look of exasperation faded as she took in Lissa's face. Hey, what's wrong? Lissa glanced at Tatiana and then turned back to Avery, taking comfort in her friend's blue-gray eyes. I need to get out of here. Lissa took a deep, calming breath. Remember all that good stuff you said you knew about? When is that going to happen? Avery smiled. As soon as you want. I returned to myself, sitting there on the curb. My emotions were still going crazy, and my eyes were fighting off tears. My earlier doubts were confirmed. Lissa didn't need me anymore, and yet I still had that feeling that there was something odd going on that I couldn't quite put a finger on. I supposed her guilt over Mia's comment or spirit side effects could be affecting her. But still, she wasn't the same Lissa. Footsteps on the pavement made me look up. Of all the people who might have found me, I would have expected Abe or maybe Victoria. But it wasn't. It was Yeva. The old woman stood there, a shawl draped over her narrow shoulders, and her sharp, cunning eyes looking down at me disapprovingly. I sighed. What happened? Did a house fall on your sister? I asked. Maybe there was a benefit to our language barrier. She pursed her lips. You can't stay here any longer, she said. My mouth dropped open. You speak English? She snorted. Of course. I shot up. All this time you've been pretending not to? You've been making Paul play translator? It's easier, she said simply. You avoid a lot of annoying conversation when you don't speak the language. And I've found that Americans make the most annoying conversation of all. I was still aghast. You don't even know me. But from the first day, you've been giving me hell. Why? Why do you hate me? I don't hate you. But I am disappointed. Disappointed? How? I dreamed you would come. I heard that. You dream a lot. Sometimes, she said. The moonlight glinted in her eyes, enhancing her otherworldly appearance. A chill ran down my spine. Sometimes my dreams are true. Sometimes not. I dreamed Dimka was dead, but I didn't want to believe it, not until I had proof. You were my proof. And that's why you were disappointed? Yeva drew the shawl more tightly around her. No. In my dreams, you shone. You burned like a star, and I saw you as a warrior, someone who could do great deeds. Instead, you've sat around and moped. You've done nothing. You haven't done what you came to do. I studied her, wondering if she really knew what she was talking about. And what is that exactly? You know what it is. I dreamed that, too. I waited for more. When it didn't come, I laughed. Nice vague answer. You're as bad as any scam fortune teller. Even in the darkness, I could see the anger kindle in her eyes. You've come to search for Dimka. To try to kill him. You must find him. What do you mean, try? I didn't want to believe her, didn't want to believe she might actually know my future. Nonetheless, I found myself getting hooked in. Have you seen what happens? Do I kill him? I can't see everything. Oh. Fantastic. I only saw that you must find him. But that's all you've got? I already knew that. It's what I saw. I groaned. Damn it, I don't have time for these cryptic clues. If you can't help me, then don't say anything. She stayed quiet. I slung my bag over my shoulder. Fine. I'm leaving then. And like that, I knew where I would go. Tell the others, well, tell them thank you for everything. And that I'm sorry. You're doing the right thing, she said. This isn't where you should be. So I've heard, I muttered, walking away. I wondered if she'd say anything else, chastise me, curse me. Give me more mysterious words of wisdom. But she stayed silent, and I didn't look back. I had no home, not here and not in America. The only thing left for me was to do what I'd come to do. I had told Abe I kept my promises. I would. I'd leave Bea like I told him. And I'd kill Dimitri, as I'd promised myself I would. I knew where to go now. The address had never left my mind. 83 Kosakova. I didn't know where it was, but once I reached the town center, I found a guy walking down the street who gave me directions. The address was close by, only about a mile. And I headed out at a brisk pace. When I reached the house, I was glad to see that the lights were still on. Even as pissed off and raging as I was, I didn't want to wake anyone up. I also didn't want to speak to Nikolai and was relieved when Dennis opened the door. His expression was all astonishment when he saw me. Despite his bold words back at the church earlier. I don't think he'd really believed I'd join him and the other unpromised ones. He was speechless, so I did the talking. I changed my mind. I'm coming with you. I took a deep breath. Bracing myself for what came next. I'd promised Abe I'd leave Bea, but I hadn't promised to return to the US, take me to Novosibirsk.